In the northeastern corner of what would one day become the United States, nature carved out one of the most remarkable geographical gifts ever bestowed upon human civilization. Long before any European ship appeared on the horizon, long before the first Native American canoe glided across its waters, the land that would become New York was already being shaped by forces far greater and older than human ambition. The story begins deep in geological time, when massive glaciers crept down from the north during the last ice age, grinding and sculpting the landscape with patient, inexorable power. These ancient rivers of ice carved out what we now know as the Hudson River Valley, creating a natural corridor that would prove invaluable to countless generations. As the glaciers retreated roughly 10,000 years ago, they left behind a topography of extraordinary strategic importance, a series of islands, bays, and waterways that seemed almost designed by Providence for human settlement and commerce. At the heart of this geographical masterpiece lies Manhattan Island, a slender strip of land approximately 13 miles long and 2 miles wide at its widest point. The island's bedrock, composed primarily of Manhattan schist, a strong, metamorphic rock formed deep within the Earth's crust, would later prove perfect for supporting the towering structures that would define the city's skyline. This solid foundation, jutting close to the surface in places like Central Park and Washington Heights, created the unique conditions that would allow New York to build upward when it could no longer expand outward. The Hudson River, flowing majestically from the Adirondack Mountains down to New York Harbor, provided something that countless other settlements could only dream of: a deep, navigable waterway that remained largely ice-free throughout the winter months. This river, which the Lenape people called Muhiakantuk, meaning the river that flows both ways, was actually a tidal estuary for much of its lower length. The ocean tides pushed salt water up the river for over 100 miles, creating a unique brackish environment that supported an incredible diversity of marine life and made navigation predictable for those who understood its rhythms. Surrounding Manhattan, a constellation of other islands and landmasses created natural harbors and protected waterways. Staten Island, with its rolling hills and fertile valleys, sat like a guardian at the mouth of the harbor. Long Island stretched eastward, its southern shore facing the Atlantic Ocean, while its northern coast embraced the protected waters of Long Island Sound. To the north and east, the mainland areas that would become the Bronx and Queens offered their own varied topography, from the rocky highlands of the Bronx to the flat plains and marshlands of Queens. The climate of this region was remarkably temperate, blessed by its position between the moderating influence of the Atlantic Ocean and the continental weather patterns of the North American interior. Summers were warm but rarely oppressive, with cooling sea breezes providing relief during the hottest days. Winters, while cold enough to freeze the smaller waterways, were generally mild enough to keep the major harbors navigable. The growing season was long and reliable, with rainfall distributed fairly evenly throughout the year. The natural resources of this area seemed almost inexhaustible to early inhabitants. The surrounding forests teemed with deer, bear, and smaller game, while the wetlands provided habitat for countless species of waterfowl. The waters themselves were extraordinarily rich. Oyster beds covered much of the harbor floor, some containing specimens larger than dinner plates. Rivers ran thick with fish during spawning seasons, particularly the massive runs of shad and striped bass that provided reliable seasonal harvests. The forests contained not only game but also valuable timber, nuts, berries, and medicinal plants. Perhaps most importantly, this geographical arrangement created natural highways for trade and communication. The Hudson River provided access to the interior of the continent, connecting the coast to the Great Lakes region through what would later become the route of the Erie Canal. The harbor itself was spacious enough to accommodate vessels of any size, yet protected enough to provide safe anchorage during storms. The various islands and waterways created multiple routes for smaller craft, allowing for efficient local transportation and trade networks. This remarkable convergence of geographical advantages, deep harbors, navigable rivers, fertile land, abundant resources, and strategic position, created the foundation upon which one of the world's greatest cities would eventually rise. The land seemed to be waiting, perfectly positioned and abundantly supplied, for the human story that would unfold upon its stage. For thousands of years before any European knew of this land's existence, the shores of what would become New York Harbor echoed with the voices of the Lenape people, whose name for themselves meant simply the original people or the common people. These were not a single tribe, but rather a collection of related bands and clans who shared similar languages, customs, and ways of understanding their relationship with the land and water that surrounded them. The Lenape, who lived in the New York area, belonged to several distinct groups, each with their own territories and characteristics, yet all part of the greater Lenape nation. On Manhattan Island and the surrounding areas lived the Manhatto, from whose name the island would take its eventual title. The word itself probably meant island of many hills, a fitting description of Manhattan's varied topography. Across the East River, in what is now Brooklyn and Queens, lived the Canarsie people, skilled navigators who gave their name to one of the most important landing places in the region. To the north, in the area that would become the Bronx and Westchester, lived the Weequahic, whose territory extended along the eastern shores of the Hudson River. These peoples had developed a sophisticated and sustainable way of life that took full advantage of the region's abundant natural resources without depleting them. Their settlements were typically established near water sources, both for transportation and for the reliable food supplies that rivers and coastal areas provided. During the warmer months, they lived in larger, more permanent villages, often consisting of longhouses that could shelter extended families or even entire clans. These structures were marvels of practical engineering, built with bent saplings covered in bark or woven mats. They were both sturdy enough to withstand storms and flexible enough to move with the wind. The Lenape followed a seasonal cycle that maximized their access to different resources throughout the year. In spring, they would prepare garden plots where the women would plant the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, crops that not only provided excellent nutrition when grown together, but actually improved the soil through their complementary growing patterns. The corn provided a natural trellis for the beans, which in turn fixed nitrogen in the soil, while the broad squash leaves shaded the ground and retained moisture. Summer was a time of abundance, when the gardens flourished and the waters provided their richest harvests. The men would venture out in their dugout canoes, some carved from single massive trees and capable of carrying several people, to fish and hunt sea mammals. They developed sophisticated techniques for harvesting oysters, which were so abundant that their shells formed massive middens that would still be visible centuries later. The women and children would gather the many edible plants that grew wild throughout the region, everything from nuts and berries to medicinal herbs and plants used for making baskets, rope, and clothing. As autumn approached, the Lenape would begin their harvest festivals, celebrating the year's bounty while preparing for the leaner months ahead. They developed ingenious methods for preserving food, smoking fish and meat, drying corn and other vegetables, and storing nuts and other non-perishables in specially constructed pits lined with bark and stones. This was also the season for hunting larger game, as deer and other animals were at their fattest and their fur was at its thickest. Winter brought a different rhythm of life. Many bands would move to smaller, more sheltered encampments, often in the protected valleys inland from the coast. This was the season for storytelling, for the creation of tools and clothing, and for the spiritual practices that helped maintain the community's connection to the land and to each other. The Lenape had developed sophisticated techniques for surviving the cold months. They knew how to make warm clothing from deer hide and fur, how to construct shelters that retained heat efficiently, and how to supplement their stored food with winter. Hunting and ice fishing. The Lenape's relationship with their environment was fundamentally different from the European understanding that would later replace it. They saw themselves not as owners of the land, but as its caretakers, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance that allowed all living things to flourish. Their hunting and fishing practices included protocols designed to ensure that animal populations remained healthy, and their agricultural techniques actually improved the fertility of the soil over time. Trade networks connected the Lenape of the New York area to peoples hundreds of miles away. They crafted wampum, intricate belts and strings made from carefully shaped and polished shell beads that served not only as a medium of exchange, but also as a way of recording important agreements and historical events. These trade routes followed the natural highways of rivers and coastlines, connecting the coast to the interior and allowing for the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices across vast distances. The social organization of the LENAPE was both democratic and sophisticated. Decisions were made through consensus, with both men and women playing important roles in community governance. Women held particular authority over agricultural matters and often had the power to select and remove chiefs. The society was organized around kinship groups, with children belonging to their mother's clan, creating complex networks of mutual obligation and support that helped ensure no one went without necessities. This rich and complex civilization had flourished in the New York area for countless generations, creating a deep and sustainable relationship with one of the world's most remarkable natural harbors. The LENAPE had no way of knowing that their world was about to change forever, as ships from across the ocean were already beginning to probe the coastlines of their ancestral home. The year 1524 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of New York, though few could have imagined the profound changes that would follow from a single ship's brief visit to the harbor. Giovanni da Verrazzano, a Florentine navigator sailing under the French flag, was the first European to set eyes upon the magnificent waterway that would one day be called New York Harbor. His ship, La Dauphine, had been exploring the North American coast for months, mapping unknown shores and searching for the elusive passage to Asia that all European powers hoped to find. Verrazzano's encounter with the region was frustratingly brief but tantalizing in its promise. As his ship approached the coast, he could see the broad mouth of a great harbor protected by a narrow entrance, what would later be called the Narrows, between Staten Island and Brooklyn. The explorer was immediately struck by the natural perfection of this anchorage, noting in his reports to the French court that it appeared capable of sheltering any number of ships. However, adverse winds prevented La Dauphine from entering the harbor, forcing Verrazzano to anchor offshore and observe this promising land from a distance. During his brief stay, Verrazzano encountered the LENAPE people, whom he described in his letters as clothed with feathers of fowls of various colors. He was impressed by their apparent friendliness and by the clear evidence of their sophisticated culture, noting their decorated clothing and ornaments. The LENAPE, for their part, approached the strange vessel with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Some brave individuals paddled out in their canoes to trade small items with the Europeans, accepting metal tools and trinkets in exchange for local goods. Verrazzano named the land Angoulême in honor of the French king, and the harbor Santa Margarita, though these names would never take hold. His description of the region, however, would survive in European records as the first written account of New York Harbor. He wrote enthusiastically about the very beautiful and pleasant landscape, the commodious port, and the apparent wealth of natural resources. Though he could spend only a few days in the area before continuing his voyage, Verrazzano had opened European eyes to the extraordinary potential of this North American harbor. For over 80 years after Verrazzano's visit, the New York region remained largely unknown to Europeans, mentioned only in scattered reports and appearing on maps as a vague indentation in the coastline. The focus of European exploration had shifted to other areas. The Spanish were establishing their empire in the Caribbean and Central America, while the French were developing their interests in Canada and the Great Lakes region. The Dutch, meanwhile, were building their maritime empire in Asia and had not yet turned their attention seriously to North America. This changed dramatically in 1609, when Henry Hudson, an experienced English navigator working for the Dutch East India Company, arrived in New York Harbor aboard his ship, the Half Moon. Hudson's mission was ostensibly the same as countless other explorers of his era, to find the Northwest Passage, a route through North America to the rich markets of Asia. However, his methodical exploration of the harbor and the great river that would bear his name would prove far more significant than any passage to the Orient. Hudson spent several days carefully exploring the harbor, anchoring near Staten Island and sending small boats to investigate the various waterways. His crew made contact with the Lenape inhabitants, and these encounters were generally peaceful, though not without moments of tension. The Europeans were amazed by the abundance of oysters in the harbor, some as large as a foot long, and by the obvious prosperity and organization of the Native American communities they encountered. Most importantly, Hudson decided to explore the great river that emptied into the harbor from the north. For over 2 weeks, the Half Moon sailed slowly up the Hudson River, stopping frequently to trade with Native American communities and to investigate tributaries and landing places. Hudson and his crew penetrated as far north as present-day Albany, approximately 150 miles from the harbor, before shoaling water convinced them that this river, magnificent as it was, would not provide the passage to Asia they sought. Hudson's detailed reports to his Dutch employers painted a picture of extraordinary commercial potential. The river provided access deep into the North American interior, reaching regions rich in furs and other valuable commodities. The Native American peoples were clearly interested in trade and possessed furs, particularly beaver pelts, that commanded high prices in European markets. The climate appeared suitable for European settlement, and the abundance of natural resources, timber, fish, fertile soil, and game, suggested that a colony could become self-sustaining relatively quickly. Perhaps most significantly, Hudson recognized the strategic value of the harbor and river system for anyone who wished to control trade in this part of North America. The harbor was not only spacious and well protected, but also perfectly positioned to serve as a base for both maritime commerce and inland trade via the river corridor. Any nation that established a strong presence here would have significant advantages over competitors seeking to exploit the resources of the North American interior. The encounters between Hudson's crew and the various Lenape groups were complex and would set patterns that would persist for generations. Both sides were clearly interested in trade, and exchanges of European metal goods for Native American furs and food proved mutually beneficial. However, cultural misunderstandings and competing concepts of ownership and territory would eventually lead to conflicts and tragedies. The Lenape, with their tradition of collective land use and seasonal movement, had no concept that matched the European notion of exclusive territorial ownership. When they welcomed Hudson's men and engaged in trade, they were following diplomatic protocols that had governed intertribal relations for centuries. The Europeans, however, interpreted these friendly gestures through the lens of their own experience with claiming and defending territory. These fundamental differences in worldview would create misunderstandings that would echo through the centuries. Hudson's exploration also revealed the sophisticated trade networks that already existed among the Native American peoples of the region. The Lenape bands he encountered possessed goods that clearly came from far inland: copper from the Great Lakes region, shells from the southern coast, and furs from territories hundreds of miles to the north and west. This existing infrastructure of trade routes and diplomatic relationships would prove invaluable to European merchants who understood how to work within it. But it also represented a complex political landscape that Europeans were only beginning to comprehend. The natural abundance that impressed Hudson and his crew was not simply a gift of nature, but the result of careful management by the Lenape over many generations. The park-like appearance of much of the landscape, with its mixture of forest and meadow, was actually the product of controlled burning and selective harvesting that maintained optimal conditions for both wildlife and human use. The Europeans saw wilderness ready for development, but they were actually observing a landscape that had been consciously shaped by human hands for thousands of years. As Hudson's expedition prepared to return to Europe, both the Dutch and the Lenape had gained their first substantial experience of each other. For the Europeans, the voyage had revealed a commercial opportunity of extraordinary potential, a region rich in resources, strategically positioned and inhabited by peoples who appeared both prosperous and interested in trade. For the Lenape, these strange visitors from across the ocean represented something entirely new in their experience: people with powerful tools and weapons, unfamiliar customs, and an apparently insatiable appetite for beaver furs. Hudson's reports, when they reached Amsterdam, would spark the interest of Dutch merchants who were always alert to new opportunities for profit. The Dutch Republic was at the height of its commercial power, and Dutch trading companies had already proven their ability to establish profitable overseas enterprises in Asia, Africa, and South America. The New York region, with its magnificent harbor and river access to the interior, seemed perfectly suited to become the next addition to the Dutch commercial empire. Neither Hudson nor the Lenape he encountered could have foreseen the consequences of this brief exploration. Within a generation, permanent European settlements would be established in the harbor, beginning a process of cultural exchange, conflict, and transformation that would ultimately create one of the world's great cities on the very shores where Native American canoes had peacefully plied the waters for thousands of years. The transformation of the New York region from a Native American homeland to a European colonial outpost began in earnest in 1624, when the first permanent Dutch settlers arrived under the auspices of the Dutch West India Company. This momentous year marked not just the beginning of European colonization in the area, but the start of New York's long journey toward becoming one of the world's great cosmopolitan centers. The Dutch West India Company, chartered in 1621, was a formidable commercial enterprise modeled on the successful Dutch East India Company. While the East India Company focused on trade with Asia, the West India Company was granted a monopoly over Dutch trade and colonization in the Americas and West Africa. The company's directors, having studied Hudson's reports and subsequent reconnaissance missions, recognized the extraordinary potential of the Manhattan region. They envisioned not just a trading post, but a permanent colony that could serve as the cornerstone of Dutch power in North America. The first group of Dutch colonists was remarkably diverse, reflecting the Netherlands' position as one of Europe's most tolerant and cosmopolitan societies. Among the approximately 30 families who made the perilous Atlantic crossing aboard the ship, New Nederland, were not only Dutch farmers and craftsmen, but also French-speaking, Walloons fleeing religious persecution, German-speaking settlers seeking economic opportunity, and even some English colonists who preferred the relatively liberal Dutch colonial policies to the stricter regimes being established by their own countrymen to the north and south. These pioneers faced the enormous challenge of establishing a European-style settlement in a landscape they barely understood, among peoples whose languages and customs were completely foreign to them. The company had provided them with basic supplies and tools, but they would need to quickly learn how to exploit local resources if they were to survive their first winters. Fortunately, many of the Lenape groups were initially welcoming, seeing potential advantages in establishing trade relationships with these newcomers who possessed such useful metal, tools and weapons. The choice of location for the first permanent settlement demonstrated both strategic wisdom and practical necessity. The colonists established their main base at the southern tip of Manhattan Island, on a site that offered several crucial advantages. The location provided excellent views up and down the harbor, allowing early warning of approaching ships, whether friendly or hostile. The southern tip was also relatively high ground, less susceptible to flooding during storms, and close to the deep water anchorages, where ocean-going vessels could safely anchor. This settlement was initially called Fort Amsterdam, emphasizing its dual function as both a defensive position and a trading center. The fort itself was a relatively modest structure by European standards, a wooden palisade, enclosing several buildings including a stone company house, soldiers' barracks, a church and storage facilities for the furs and other goods that were the colony's economic lifeblood. However, the fort's importance lay not in its military strength, but in its position as the administrative and commercial hub of what the Dutch called New Netherland. The early years of New Amsterdam were marked by a constant struggle to balance commercial success with the practical challenges of frontier life. The Dutch West India Company expected the colony to generate profits quickly, primarily through the fur trade with Native American peoples of the interior. However, the colonists soon discovered that successful trade required much more than simply exchanging European goods for furs. They needed to understand complex Native American political relationships, seasonal migration patterns, and the intricate protocols that governed intertribal commerce. The company appointed a series of directors general to govern the colony, men who faced the nearly impossible task of satisfying profit-driven investors in Amsterdam while managing the day-to-day challenges of life in a wilderness settlement. These early administrators had to negotiate with Native American leaders, maintain discipline among a diverse and often unruly colonial population, organize defenses against potential enemies, and somehow make the whole enterprise profitable, enough to justify continued investment from the Netherlands. The physical development of early New Amsterdam reflected both European urban planning traditions and the practical necessities of colonial life. The settlement gradually expanded northward from the fort, with streets laid out in a somewhat haphazard pattern that followed the natural contours of the land and the paths that had been worn by decades of use. The famous Wall Street received its name from a wooden wall that was constructed across Lower Manhattan in the 1640s, designed to protect the settlement from potential attacks from the north. From its earliest days, New Amsterdam displayed the characteristics that would eventually make New York famous throughout the world. The population was remarkably diverse, not only in terms of national origin, but also in religion, economic background, and social status. The Dutch Reformed Church was officially established, but other Protestant denominations were generally tolerated, and even Catholics and Jews found more acceptance than they would have in most other European colonies of the period. Trade was the lifeblood of the settlement, and the harbor quickly became a bustling center of commercial activity. Dutch ships arrived regularly with manufactured goods, wine, and other European products, departing with holds full of furs, timber, and other North American commodities. The colonists also developed trade relationships with other European settlements along the coast, creating a network of commercial connections that would grow. Increasingly important as the century progressed, the relationship between the Dutch colonists and the various Lenape groups was complex and often troubled. Despite the generally peaceful intentions on both sides, cultural misunderstandings were frequent and sometimes led to violence. The most famous of these early conflicts occurred in 1643 to 1645, during what became known as Kieft's War, named after Director General Willem Kieft, whose harsh policies toward Native Americans led to widespread fighting that threatened the very survival of the colony. Despite these challenges, New Amsterdam continued to grow and prosper throughout the middle decades of the 17th century. The settlement attracted merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and adventurers from throughout Europe, and even from other parts of North America. By the 1660s, the little trading post that had begun with 30 families had grown into a thriving town of over 1,000 inhabitants, with substantial brick houses, a proper church, a school, and all the amenities of a European colonial center. The stage was now set for the next great transformation in the region's history. As the growing prosperity and strategic importance of New Amsterdam began to attract the attention of other European powers, particularly the English, who were beginning to view the Dutch presence in North America as an obstacle to their own imperial ambitions. The year 1626 witnessed one of the most famous and misunderstood transactions in American history, when Peter Minuit, the newly appointed Director General of New Netherland, negotiated what Europeans would forever after call the purchase of Manhattan Island. This legendary deal, in which Minuit allegedly acquired the entire island for goods worth 60 guilders, often translated as $24 in later American currency, has become one of the most enduring myths of New York's founding, though the reality was far more complex and nuanced than popular legend suggests. Peter Minuit arrived in New Amsterdam as a man with a mission. The Dutch West India Company had grown frustrated with the slow progress of their North American venture, and had chosen Minuit specifically for his reputation as an effective administrator and skilled negotiator. Born in Germany to French Protestant parents, Minuit embodied the international character that would always define New York. He understood that the success of New Amsterdam depended not just on profitable trade, but on establishing legitimate and lasting relationships with the Native American peoples, who still constituted the vast majority of the region's population. The transaction that took place in May 1626 between Minuit and representatives of the Lenape people was, from the Native American perspective, likely something very different from a real estate sale. The LENAPE concept of land use involved seasonal rights, shared territories, and collective stewardship rather than exclusive ownership in the European sense. When they accepted Minuit's gifts of metal tools, cloth, and other manufactured goods, they were probably agreeing to allow the Dutch to establish settlements and use certain areas, not transferring absolute ownership of the entire island in perpetuity. The goods that changed hands in this famous transaction included practical items that the LENAPE genuinely valued. Iron kettles that were far superior to ceramic pottery for cooking, metal knives and hatchets that held better edges than stone tools, woolen cloth that provided excellent insulation, and glass beads that could be incorporated into their sophisticated decorative traditions. From the LENAPE perspective, this was likely seen as establishing a trade relationship and mutual agreement for shared use of the land, not an irreversible transfer of exclusive property rights. Regardless of these cultural misunderstandings, the 1626 agreement provided the Dutch with what they considered legal justification for their growing settlement, and New Amsterdam began to develop rapidly under Minuit's capable leadership. The Director General proved to be both a pragmatic administrator and a visionary planner who understood that the colony's success would depend on more than just the fur trade that had initially attracted Dutch investment. The harbor development under Minuit's guidance transformed the southern tip of Manhattan into a bustling commercial center. Dutch engineers, renowned throughout Europe for their skill in managing water and constructing harbors, applied their expertise to create proper docking facilities, warehouses, and defensive positions. They built a substantial pier extending into the East River, allowing larger ships to load and unload efficiently. Storage facilities were constructed to handle the growing volume of trade goods flowing through the port, from beaver pelts heading to Europe to manufactured goods arriving from Amsterdam. The fur trade itself became increasingly sophisticated and far-reaching under Dutch management. Native American trappers and traders from hundreds of miles in the interior began making regular journeys to New Amsterdam, following river routes and ancient trails to bring their pelts to the Dutch market. The colonists learned to distinguish between different types and qualities of furs, with thick winter beaver pelts commanding the highest prices. They also discovered that success in the fur trade required maintaining diplomatic relationships with competing Native American groups and understanding the complex political dynamics of interior regions they had never seen. Dutch architecture began to transform the physical appearance of New Amsterdam, creating a distinctive colonial style that blended Old World traditions with New World practicalities. The typical Dutch colonial house featured a steeply pitched roof designed to shed snow efficiently, often with distinctive stepped gables that became a signature of New Amsterdam architecture. These houses were typically built of brick or stone when materials were available, though many early structures combined European building techniques with local materials like timber and thatch. The urban planning of New Amsterdam reflected Dutch expertise in creating efficient, organized settlements. The town's layout, while necessarily adapted to Manhattan's topography, followed Dutch principles of practical city design. Streets were laid out to facilitate commerce and movement, with the main thoroughfare running parallel to the harbor to maximize access to shipping. The central square, later known as the Bowling Green, served as a gathering place for public announcements, markets, and community events. Perhaps the most remarkable characteristic of early New Amsterdam was its extraordinary diversity, which set it apart from virtually every other European settlement in North America. The Dutch Republic's tradition of religious tolerance and commercial pragmatism attracted immigrants from throughout Europe and beyond. The settlement's population included not only Dutch farmers and merchants, but also French-speaking Walloons, German craftsmen, Scandinavian laborers, English dissenters, Portuguese Jews, and even freed African slaves who had earned their liberty through military service or skilled labor. This diversity extended to religious practices as well. While the Dutch Reformed Church was officially established and received government support, other Protestant denominations were generally tolerated and sometimes even welcomed. The colony's leadership understood that religious persecution was bad for business, driving away potentially valuable settlers and creating unnecessary social tensions. This practical tolerance would become one of New Amsterdam's defining characteristics and would later influence the development of American concepts of religious freedom. The African presence in New Amsterdam was significant from the colony's earliest days, though the institution of slavery developed somewhat differently than in other American colonies. Some Africans arrived as slaves, but others came as free laborers or earned their freedom through various means. The relatively small scale of New Amsterdam's economy and the diverse nature of its population meant that racial boundaries were often more fluid than they would become in later periods. Though discrimination and exploitation certainly existed, women in New Amsterdam enjoyed somewhat greater legal rights and social freedoms than their counterparts in many other colonies. Dutch law traditionally provided women with more protections regarding property rights and business activities, and these traditions were generally maintained in the colonial setting. Women could own property, engage in trade, and represent themselves in legal proceedings under certain circumstances. The economic foundation of New Amsterdam extended well beyond the fur trade that had initially attracted Dutch investment. The settlement developed substantial agricultural activities in the surrounding areas, with Dutch farmers applying Old World techniques to New World crops. They grew traditional European grains like wheat and rye, alongside Native American crops like corn and squash. The combination of fertile soil, adequate rainfall, and growing markets made agriculture increasingly profitable. Small-scale manufacturing also began to develop, as craftsmen established workshops to serve both local needs and export markets. Breweries were among the earliest industries, producing beer both for local consumption and for trade with other colonies. Blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, and other artisans found ready markets for their skills in a growing settlement, where European manufactured goods were expensive and often unavailable. By the end of Peter Minuit's tenure as Director General, New Amsterdam had been transformed from a precarious trading post into a genuine town with a distinct character and promising future. The foundation had been laid for what would eventually become one of the world's great cities, built on principles of commercial enterprise, cultural diversity, and practical tolerance that would continue to define New York for centuries to come. The arrival of Peter Stuyvesant as Director General of New Netherland in 1647 marked the beginning of the most dynamic and turbulent period in Dutch colonial history. Stuyvesant, a stern and pious man whose wooden leg had earned him the nickname Pegleg Piet among the colonists, brought to New Amsterdam a combination of military discipline, administrative skill, and religious conviction that would transform the colony while also creating lasting tensions that would influence its eventual fate. Dutch Stuyvesant's appointment came at a crucial moment in New Amsterdam's development. The colony had grown substantially since its founding, but it faced increasing challenges from competing European powers, restive Native American neighbors, and internal divisions among its diverse population. The Dutch West India Company's directors in Amsterdam had grown concerned about reports of administrative chaos, military weakness, and declining profitability. They needed a strong leader who could restore order and make the colony more profitable. And in Stuyvesant, they believed they had found their man. The new Director General arrived with ambitious plans for expanding Dutch control throughout the region that would later become the Greater New York metropolitan area. Under his leadership, the colony began its first systematic efforts to establish permanent settlements beyond Manhattan Island, extending Dutch authority to areas that had previously been visited only by traders and explorers. This expansion was driven by both economic opportunity and strategic necessity, as English settlements to the north and south were beginning to encroach on territories that the Dutch considered rightfully theirs. The expansion into what would later become Brooklyn began with the establishment of several small farming communities in the fertile areas near the East River. Dutch and other European settlers cleared land for agriculture, built mills to process grain, and created a network of roads and ferries connecting these new settlements to Manhattan. The area that would become Brooklyn proved ideal for grain production, and Dutch farmers quickly established profitable operations that helped supply not only the growing population of New Amsterdam, but also ships engaged in Atlantic trade, Staten Island presented different opportunities and challenges for Dutch expansion. The island's rolling hills and numerous streams made it excellent for both agriculture and small-scale manufacturing, particularly milling. However, Staten Island's Native American population was more resistant to European settlement than groups closer to Manhattan had been. Stuyvesant was forced to negotiate carefully with Lenape leaders, while also maintaining enough military pressure to discourage resistance to Dutch expansion. The area that would become the Bronx offered strategic advantages that Stuyvesant was quick to recognize. The high ground along the Harlem River provided excellent defensive positions and commanding views over both the Hudson River and Long Island Sound. Dutch settlers established farms and trading posts throughout the region, creating a network of settlements that could serve as early warning systems against potential attacks, while also facilitating trade with Native American groups in the interior. Stuyvesant's expansion efforts, however, inevitably led to increased conflicts with the various Lenape groups who had inhabited these territories for countless generations. These conflicts arose not just from competition for land, but from fundamental differences in understanding how land should be used and controlled. The Dutch concept of exclusive property ownership clashed repeatedly with Native American traditions of seasonal use and collective stewardship, leading to misunderstandings that sometimes erupted into violence. The most serious of these conflicts occurred during the period known as Peachtree War in 1655, when a series of incidents involving Dutch colonists and Lenape inhabitants escalated into widespread fighting that threatened the survival of several outlying settlements. The conflict began with relatively minor disputes over property damage and livestock, but cultural misunderstandings and mutual mistrust quickly transformed these local problems into a broader war that involved multiple Native American groups and threatened the security of New Amsterdam itself. Stuyvesant's response to these conflicts revealed both his strengths and weaknesses as a colonial administrator. His military background enabled him to organize effective defenses and coordinate counterattacks that eventually restored Dutch control over contested areas. However, his rigid personality and cultural insensitivity often made negotiations more difficult than they needed to be, preventing the kind of diplomatic solutions that might have avoided bloodshed and created more stable long-term relationships. Despite these military challenges, Stuyvesant proved to be an effective administrator who established many of the legal and institutional foundations that would serve the region well under both Dutch and later English rule. He created the first systematic legal code for the colony, establishing courts, defining property rights, and codifying commercial regulations that brought much-needed order to what had often been chaotic business practices. The establishment of formal municipal government marked a crucial step in New Amsterdam's evolution from trading post to genuine city. Stuyvesant created a board of burgomasters and schepens, magistrates, who were responsible for local administration, law enforcement, and public works. This system, based on Dutch municipal traditions, provided colonists with a voice in local governance, while maintaining the Director General's ultimate authority over major policy decisions. Religious institutions also developed significantly during Stuyvesant's tenure, though not always in ways that the deeply Calvinist Director General approved. The Dutch Reformed Church strengthened its position as the colony's established denomination, constructing more substantial buildings and expanding its educational activities. However, the colony's diverse population continued to practice various forms of Christianity, and Stuyvesant found himself constantly struggling to balance his personal religious convictions with the practical necessity of maintaining tolerance for the beliefs of valuable colonists. Education became a priority during this period, with the establishment of formal schools that provided instruction in both Dutch and Latin. The colonial government recognized that education was essential for maintaining Dutch cultural traditions while also preparing young colonists for participation in an increasingly complex commercial economy. These early schools served children from various ethnic and religious backgrounds, reflecting the cosmopolitan character that continued to define New Amsterdam. Economic development accelerated significantly under Stuyvesant's administration, as the colony diversified beyond its original focus on the fur trade. Agriculture became increasingly important as Dutch farmers demonstrated that European crops could thrive in the New York climate when combined with Native American agricultural techniques. The development of flour milling created one of the colony's first major export industries, as New Amsterdam grain found ready markets throughout the Caribbean and even in Europe. The growth of shipbuilding represented another important economic development, as Dutch craftsmen began constructing vessels designed specifically for North American coastal trade. The abundance of excellent timber in the region, combined with the expertise of Dutch shipwrights, created an industry that served both local needs and export markets. These locally built ships proved essential for maintaining trade connections between New Amsterdam and other Dutch settlements, as well as for conducting business with English and French colonies, despite official policies that often discouraged such commerce. By the early 1660s, under Stuyvesant's leadership, New Amsterdam had been transformed from a struggling trading post into the center of a substantial and prosperous colony. The settlement boasted over 1,500 inhabitants, representing numerous nationalities and religious backgrounds. Substantial brick houses lined well-planned streets, and the harbor bustled with commercial activity that connected New Amsterdam to markets throughout the Atlantic world. However, this very success would soon attract the attention of New Amsterdam's English neighbors, who had begun to view the prosperous Dutch colony as both an attractive prize and a strategic obstacle to their own imperial ambitions. The stage was being set for the next great transformation in the region's history, as political developments in Europe would soon reshape the colonial landscape of North America in ways that neither Stuyvesant nor his colonists could anticipate. The late summer of 1664 brought one of the most dramatic and consequential changes in New York's long history, yet it unfolded with surprising calm and little of the violence that might have been expected when one European power seized control of another's prized colonial possession. The English conquest of New Amsterdam was the result of careful planning, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic timing that reflected the broader imperial rivalries reshaping the Atlantic world in the mid-17th century. The roots of this conquest lay not in the harbors and streets of New Amsterdam, but in the royal courts and commercial centers of Europe, where the ongoing competition between England and the Dutch Republic had been intensifying for decades. The two Protestant maritime powers had much in common: traditions of religious tolerance, commercial innovation, and republican governance. But these similarities only intensified their rivalry for control of the world's most profitable trade routes and colonial territories. King Charles II of England, restored to his throne in 1660 after years of Republican rule under Oliver Cromwell, was determined to assert English dominance over North American colonization. The Dutch colony of New Netherland represented a significant obstacle to English ambitions, creating a wedge between the English settlements of New England and the growing tobacco colonies of Virginia and Maryland. From the English perspective, Dutch control of the Hudson River and New York Harbor was an intolerable barrier to the development of a unified English colonial empire along the Atlantic coast. The king's solution was both elegant and audacious. He granted the entire Dutch territory to his brother James, the Duke of York, as a proprietary colony before the English had actually conquered it. This preemptive land grant demonstrated Charles II's confidence in English military superiority, but it also reflected a sophisticated understanding of colonial administration. By making James the proprietor of the future colony, the king ensured that the conquest would be followed by stable governance under someone with both the authority and the resources to manage such a valuable possession. The English expedition that sailed into New York Harbor in late August 1664 was carefully planned to maximize the likelihood of a peaceful surrender, while demonstrating overwhelming force should resistance be attempted. Colonel Richard Nichols, appointed as the Duke of York's deputy governor, commanded 4 warships carrying approximately 300 soldiers, a force substantial enough to overwhelm any resistance that the Dutch might organize, but not so large as to appear purely aggressive. Peter Stuyvesant, now serving his 17th year as Director General of New Netherland, faced an impossible situation when the English fleet appeared off Staten Island. His pleas to the Dutch West India Company for military reinforcements had gone largely unanswered, leaving him with fewer than 150 soldiers to defend a settlement that had grown far beyond the capacity of its original fortifications. Moreover, many of the colony's inhabitants were not Dutch and felt little loyalty to the Netherlands, while even some Dutch colonists had grown frustrated with the authoritarian style of governance that Stuyvesant represented. The negotiations that followed were a masterpiece of diplomatic theatre, with both sides understanding that the outcome was probably predetermined, while still maintaining the forms of proper military protocol. Nichols anchored his fleet in the harbour, where their guns could command the town while opening communications with Stuyvesant through a series of formal messages that combined military ultimatums with generous terms for surrender. The English terms were remarkably liberal, reflecting both Nichols's instructions from the Duke of York and his own understanding that a successful conquest required the cooperation of the existing population. The Articles of Surrender guaranteed that Dutch inhabitants could remain in their homes, continue their businesses, maintain their property rights, and even practice their religion freely. Former Dutch officials would be allowed to leave with their personal possessions if they chose, or they could remain and potentially serve in the new English administration. Stuyvesant's initial instinct was to resist, and he reportedly declared that he would rather be carried out dead than surrender the colony he had served for so long. However, the Director General was ultimately a pragmatic man who understood that resistance would mean the destruction of the community he had worked so hard to build. When prominent Dutch colonists, including some of his own advisors, urged him to accept the English terms, Stuyvesant reluctantly agreed to surrender. On September 8, 1664, the formal transfer of power took place with ceremonial dignity that masked the profound historical significance of the moment. Dutch soldiers marched out of Fort Amsterdam with full military honors, their flags flying and drums beating, while English troops took possession of the fortifications that controlled access to one of North America's finest harbors. The Dutch flag was lowered and the English banner raised, symbolically marking the end of Dutch political control over the region that had been the center of their North American empire. The renaming of the colony from New Amsterdam to New York reflected both English imperial ambitions and the specific role that the Duke of York had played in organizing the conquest. The choice of name was also politically astute, as it honored the royal family while establishing a clear English identity for the former Dutch territory. The main settlement became New York City, while the broader region retained the name New York, establishing nomenclature that would endure for centuries. Richard Nichols proved to be an exceptionally capable administrator who understood that the success of English rule would depend on maintaining continuity with Dutch practices while gradually introducing English legal and administrative systems. Rather than attempting to impose dramatic changes immediately, Nichols allowed many Dutch institutions to continue functioning while slowly integrating English colonial practices. This gradual approach helped prevent the social disruption that might have accompanied a more dramatic transformation. The legal transition was particularly carefully managed, as Nichols recognized that commercial relationships and property rights formed the foundation of the colony's prosperity. Dutch legal documents were recognized as valid, contracts remained in force, and the complex web of property ownership that had developed over 4 decades of Dutch rule was preserved. This legal continuity was essential for maintaining the confidence of merchants and investors, whose continued participation was necessary for the colony's economic success. Religious transition proceeded with similar sensitivity, as the English authorities recognized that the colony's diversity was one of its greatest strengths. The Dutch Reformed Church retained its buildings and much of its influence, while other Protestant denominations continued to worship freely. This religious tolerance was somewhat unusual in English colonial practice, but reflected both practical necessity and the influence of the Duke of York's own Catholic sympathies. The cultural transformation was more gradual and complex, as English and Dutch traditions began to blend in ways that would create distinctively New York characteristics. The Dutch language continued to be widely spoken, especially in rural areas, while English gradually became the language of government and commerce. Dutch architectural styles influenced English building practices, while English legal traditions modified Dutch commercial customs. Perhaps most importantly, the English conquest preserved and actually enhanced the cosmopolitan character that had made New Amsterdam unique among North American settlements. The new English authorities, like their Dutch predecessors, recognized that the colony's diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness. Immigration continued to be encouraged, and the colony remained a haven for people seeking economic opportunity, regardless of their national origin or religious background. The conquest of 1664 thus represented both a dramatic political transformation and a remarkable example of cultural continuity. While the flags and the formal structures of government had changed, the essential character of the region, its commercial focus, cultural diversity, and strategic importance remained intact. The foundation had been laid for New York's eventual emergence as one of the world's great cities, built on the solid base of Dutch colonial achievement and English imperial resources. The transformation of New York from Dutch New Amsterdam to English colonial possession required far more than simply changing flags and renaming streets. The decades following the 1664 conquest witnessed a complex process of integration, adaptation, and growth that would establish the patterns of development that would characterize New York for generations to come. Under English rule, the former Dutch colony would evolve into one of the most important and prosperous settlements in North America, while retaining much of the distinctive character that had made it unique under Dutch administration. The task of integrating New York into the broader English colonial system fell initially to Richard Nicolls and his successors as royal governors, men who faced the delicate challenge of satisfying the expectations of English imperial administrators while maintaining the loyalty and cooperation of a population that remained predominantly non-English. The success of this integration process would depend largely on the English authorities' willingness to respect the established customs and institutions that had made the Dutch colony prosperous while gradually introducing English legal and administrative practices. One of the most significant changes involved the colony's relationship to the broader Atlantic commercial system. Under Dutch rule, New Amsterdam had been primarily oriented toward trade with the Netherlands and other Dutch colonies, though illegal commerce with English settlements had always been common. English conquest opened legitimate access to the rapidly expanding English colonial trade networks, connecting New York to the growing markets of the Caribbean sugar islands, the tobacco colonies of Virginia and Maryland, and the increasingly diverse economy of New England. The development of what became known as the triangular trade proved particularly beneficial to New York's merchants, who found themselves perfectly positioned to exploit their harbor's advantages in this complex commercial system. Ships departing New York would carry grain, flour, and other provisions to the Caribbean, where these products were exchanged for sugar, molasses, and other tropical goods. The Caribbean products would then be transported to England, where they were traded for manufactured goods that were brought back to New York for local consumption or further trade. This integration into English commercial networks was facilitated by the Navigation Acts, a series of laws designed to ensure that colonial trade benefited the mother country while providing colonies with protected markets for their products. While these laws imposed certain restrictions on colonial commerce, they also guaranteed New York merchants access to English and Caribbean markets that had previously been difficult to enter legally. The result was a dramatic expansion in the volume and profitability of trade flowing through New York Harbor. The agricultural development of the region accelerated significantly under English rule as settlers began to exploit more fully the fertile lands surrounding the original Dutch settlements. The areas that would later become the outer boroughs of New York City proved particularly suitable for grain production, and English colonial policies encouraged agricultural exports to help supply other colonies and English territories in the Caribbean. The development of flour milling became one of New York's first major industries, with mills along the various streams and rivers processing grain for both local consumption and export. The key population growth that accompanied this economic expansion was remarkable, both in its pace and in its diversity. English immigration increased substantially after 1664, but the colony continued to attract settlers from throughout Europe and even from other North American colonies. The religious tolerance that had characterized Dutch New Amsterdam was largely maintained under English rule, making New York an attractive destination for religious minorities facing persecution elsewhere. The Huguenots, French Protestants fleeing religious persecution in Catholic France, represented one of the most significant groups of new immigrants during this period. These skilled craftsmen, merchants, and farmers brought valuable expertise and capital to the colony, while adding another layer to New York's already complex cultural mixture. The Huguenots established their own neighborhoods and institutions while integrating successfully into the broader colonial economy. German immigration also increased significantly during the English period, as the various conflicts and economic difficulties affecting the German states drove many families to seek opportunities in North America. These German settlers, often called Palatines regardless of their specific origin, proved particularly valuable as farmers and craftsmen. They established communities throughout the Hudson River Valley while maintaining connections to the growing German populations in Pennsylvania and other colonies. The African population of New York grew substantially during this period, though the experiences of people of African descent varied considerably, depending on their legal status and circumstances. The institution of slavery became more systematically organized under English rule, as the colony was integrated into the Atlantic slave trade that supplied labor for English plantations throughout the Americas. However, New York's diverse economy continued to provide opportunities for some Africans to earn their freedom or to work as free laborers, creating a complex racial hierarchy that would influence the region's development for generations. The legal and institutional framework that emerged during the early decades of English rule reflected an interesting synthesis of Dutch precedent and English practice. The Duke's Laws, promulgated in 1665, provided a comprehensive legal code that borrowed heavily from New England legal traditions while incorporating many Dutch commercial and property law concepts. This hybrid legal system proved well suited to the colony's diverse population and complex economy. Local government evolved gradually from Dutch municipal traditions toward English county and town systems, though the process was often contentious and incomplete. The city of New York received a new charter in 1686 that formally established it as an English municipality with elected officials and defined powers, but many Dutch administrative practices continued at the local level. The rural areas of the colony developed a mixture of town and county governments that reflected both English precedent and local preferences. Religious institutions underwent significant changes during this period, though the general atmosphere of tolerance that had characterized the Dutch period was largely maintained. The Church of England was established as the official denomination in some parts of the colony, but it never achieved the dominance that characterized English religious arrangements in other colonies. The Dutch Reformed Church retained much of its influence, while Presbyterian, Baptist, and other Protestant denominations found opportunities to establish themselves. The gradual emergence of tensions between the colonists and English imperial administrators reflected broader patterns that were developing throughout English North America during this period. As the colony became more prosperous and self-confident, its residents began to chafe under certain imperial restrictions and policies. The Navigation Acts, while beneficial in many ways, also limited colonial freedom to trade with whomever offered the best prices. Imperial taxes and regulations designed to extract revenue for the English treasury were often viewed as burdensome and unfair. These early tensions were relatively mild compared to the conflicts that would develop in the following century, but they established patterns of resistance and accommodation that would characterize New York's relationship with imperial authority for generations. The colony's merchants and landowners learned to work within the imperial system while quietly circumventing restrictions that threatened their interests. This pragmatic approach to imperial relations would become one of New York's defining characteristics. By the end of the 17th century, New York had been successfully transformed from a Dutch trading post into a thriving English colony that retained much of its original, cosmopolitan character while gaining access to the resources and markets of the expanding English Empire. The foundation had been laid for the dramatic growth and development that would make New York one of North America's most important cities, built on a unique synthesis of Dutch tolerance, English commercial law, and immigrant enterprise that would continue to define the region's character for centuries to come. By the dawn of the 18th century, New York Harbor had emerged as the beating commercial heart of British North America, its strategic location and natural advantages combining with decades of careful development to create what many considered the finest port between Boston and Charleston. The transformation of this once modest Dutch trading post into the colony's premier commercial center represented one of the most remarkable success stories of early American development, built on a foundation of geographic privilege, cultural diversity, and entrepreneurial ambition that would continue to define New York's character for centuries to come. The harbor's supremacy among colonial ports stemmed from a unique combination of natural and human factors that no other North American city could match. The deep, protected waters of New York Harbor could accommodate the largest ocean-going vessels of the era, while remaining ice-free throughout most winters, when northern ports like Boston became difficult to navigate. The Hudson River provided unparalleled access to the interior regions of the continent, allowing New York merchants to tap into fur trades and agricultural markets hundreds of miles inland. Perhaps most importantly, the city's position roughly halfway along the North American coast made it an ideal center for the complex triangular trades that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The sugar trade became the cornerstone of New York's commercial prosperity during this period, as the city's merchants developed increasingly sophisticated relationships with plantation owners throughout the British Caribbean. Ships departing New York's wharves carried flour, salted meat, timber, and other provisions essential to sustaining the slave-based sugar economy of islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. These products were exchanged for raw sugar, molasses, and rum, which were then transported either to England for further processing or to other North American markets, where they commanded premium prices. The profits from this Caribbean trade were enormous, and they flowed through New York's economy in ways that benefited virtually every sector of colonial society. Shipbuilders found steady demand for vessels designed specifically for Caribbean routes, while rope makers, sail makers, and other maritime craftsmen prospered from the constant need to maintain and equip the growing merchant fleet. Coopers, who manufactured the barrels essential for transporting sugar and molasses, became some of the city's most prosperous artisans, while dock workers, teamsters, and sailors found steady employment in the bustling harbor. The tobacco trade provided another crucial pillar of New York's commercial success, though it operated somewhat differently from the sugar trade. Virginia and Maryland tobacco was often shipped to New York for re-export to European markets, taking advantage of the city's superior shipping connections and more sophisticated financial services. New York merchants also became heavily involved in financing tobacco production, providing planters with credit for purchasing slaves, equipment, and supplies in exchange for exclusive rights to market their crops. Perhaps the most morally troubling aspect of New York's commercial expansion was its deep involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, which brought enormous profits to the city's merchants while inflicting immeasurable suffering on countless African men, women, and children. New York's role in this horrific traffic was complex and multifaceted. The city served not only as a market for slaves destined for plantation labor throughout the colonies, but also as a major port for the ships that transported Africans across the Atlantic in conditions of unimaginable brutality. The profits from slave trading permeated New York's economy in ways that touched virtually every aspect of colonial life. The ships used in the slave trade were built in New York shipyards, financed by New York merchants, and insured by New York companies. The rum and sugar that were often used to purchase slaves in Africa were processed and refined in New York distilleries. Even those colonists who never directly participated Slave trading benefited from the economic activity and capital accumulation that the traffic generated. This commercial prosperity gave rise to a new merchant class that would dominate New York's economic and social life for generations. Families like the Livingstons, Van Rensselaers, and Beekmans accumulated vast fortunes through their involvement in international trade, using their profits to purchase extensive landholdings and establish themselves as a colonial aristocracy. These merchant princes lived in increasingly elaborate homes, imported luxury goods from Europe, and sent their children to the finest schools available in America or abroad. The concentration of wealth and commercial activity in Lower Manhattan led to the gradual development of what would eventually become Wall Street as the colony's financial center. The area took its name from the defensive wall that the Dutch had constructed across the island in the 1640s, but by the early 18th century, it had evolved into the natural gathering place for merchants, bankers and traders who needed to conduct the complex financial transactions that international commerce required. The primitive banking and insurance services that developed along Wall Street during this period were essential to New York's commercial success. Merchants needed credit to finance their trading ventures, which often required substantial initial investments months before any returns could be expected. They also needed insurance to protect against the many risks of maritime commerce, storms, pirates, war, and simple accidents that could destroy months of careful planning and investment. The financial institutions that emerged to meet these needs were often informal and personal, based on family connections and community trust, rather than formal banking procedures. The growth of New York's port also stimulated the development of supporting industries throughout the region. Flour milling became particularly important as farmers throughout the Hudson River Valley and Long Island increased their grain production to meet the growing demand from Caribbean sugar planters. The Bolting Act of 1678, which gave New York City a monopoly on flour processing and export, ensured that virtually all grain produced in the region had to be milled within the city limits, creating a thriving industry that employed hundreds of workers and generated substantial tax revenues. Shipbuilding emerged as another crucial industry, as New York's merchants discovered that locally built vessels were often better suited to their specific trading needs than ships purchased in England or other colonies. The abundance of excellent timber in the region, combined with the presence of skilled craftsmen from various European traditions, created ideal conditions for developing a sophisticated shipbuilding industry. New York-built ships became renowned throughout the Atlantic world for their speed, durability, and innovative design features. The social consequences of this commercial expansion were profound and far-reaching. The growing wealth and sophistication of New York's merchant class created demand for cultural amenities that had previously been unknown in the colonies. The first theaters, libraries, and schools of higher learning began to appear, while wealthy families imported European tutors and governesses to educate their children according to the highest standards of the day. However, this growing prosperity also created new forms of social tension and inequality. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically as merchant fortunes grew, while the wages of ordinary workers failed to keep pace with rising prices for housing and food. The presence of large numbers of enslaved Africans created a complex racial hierarchy that influenced every aspect of colonial society, while the constant arrival of new immigrants created ethnic and religious tensions that sometimes erupted into violence. The political implications of New York's commercial success were equally significant. The merchant class that controlled the city's trade also wielded enormous influence over colonial politics, using their wealth and connections to shape government policies in ways that protected and promoted their interests. This concentration of economic and political power would play a crucial role in the revolutionary crisis that was beginning to develop by the 1760s, as New York's merchants found themselves increasingly at odds with British imperial policies that threatened their profitable trading relationships. By mid-century, New York had clearly established itself as the commercial capital of British North America, its harbor bustling with ships from around the world and its merchants controlling trading networks that spanned 3 continents. The foundation had been laid for the city's eventual emergence as one of the world's great commercial centers, built on a combination of geographic advantages, entrepreneurial skill, and international connections that would continue to drive growth and development for generations to come. The decade of the 1760s brought a fundamental shift in the relationship between New York and the British Empire, as new imperial policies designed to extract revenue from the American colonies collided with colonial expectations of self-governance and economic freedom that had developed during more than a century of relative autonomy. New York, with its sophisticated merchant class and tradition of political independence, became one of the most important centers of resistance to British taxation and regulation, setting the stage for the revolutionary crisis that would transform not only the city, but the entire Atlantic world. The immediate catalyst for this growing tension was the Stamp Act of 1765, the British Parliament's attempt to raise revenue from the American colonies by requiring tax stamps on virtually all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, dice, and even marriage licenses. For New York's merchants and lawyers, who relied heavily on the flow of commercial and legal documentation that kept their businesses functioning, the Stamp Act represented both a financial burden and a dangerous precedent for unlimited British taxation. The reaction in New York was swift and dramatic. The city's merchants, led by figures like Isaac Sears and Alexander McDougall, organized what they called the Sons of Liberty, a group dedicated to coordinating resistance to British tax policies through both legal protest and, when necessary, intimidation of those who attempted to enforce unpopular laws. The Sons of Liberty represented a new type of political organization in colonial America, a popular movement that drew support from merchants, artisans, and workers while maintaining connections to more elite political leaders. At the arrival of the first shipment of tax stamps in New York Harbor in October 1765 triggered some of the most dramatic protests in colonial American history. Crowds of demonstrators, estimated at over 2,000 people, gathered at the waterfront to prevent the stamps from being distributed. When the royal governor attempted to store the stamps in Fort George for safekeeping, protesters surrounded the installation and demanded their destruction. The lieutenant governor's home was threatened, and effigies of unpopular officials were burned in the streets, while crowds shouted, "Liberty, property, and no stamps." These protests were remarkable not only for their size and intensity, but also for their organization and restraint. The Sons of Liberty had learned to mobilize popular anger while maintaining enough discipline to avoid the kind of random violence that might discredit their cause or provoke harsh military retaliation. The demonstrations included carefully choreographed elements, formal speeches, symbolic burnings, and organized marches that maximized their political impact while minimizing the risk of serious disorder. The success of the Anti-Stamp Act protests in New York encouraged similar resistance movements throughout the colonies, leading ultimately to the law's repeal in 1766. However, this victory proved temporary, as the British Parliament almost immediately began developing new taxation schemes that would prove even more controversial. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed taxes on tea, glass, paper, paint, and lead imported into the colonies, while also establishing new customs enforcement mechanisms that threatened the profitable smuggling activities that had long been a part of colonial commerce. New York's response to the Townshend Acts revealed the growing sophistication of colonial resistance movements. Rather than relying solely on street protests, the city's merchants organized systematic boycotts of British goods, coordinating their efforts with similar movements in other major ports. These non-importation agreements were remarkably effective, reducing British exports to the colonies by over 40% and creating pressure on British manufacturers and merchants to lobby for repeal of the unpopular taxes. The political debate that accompanied these resistance movements fundamentally changed the nature of public discourse in colonial New York. Newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides provided forums for increasingly sophisticated discussions of constitutional principles, natural rights, and the proper relationship between government and citizens. Writers like John Peter Zenger had earlier established New York's reputation for press freedom. And this tradition now served the resistance movement as writers and editors used their publications to coordinate opposition and articulate the intellectual foundations of colonial resistance. The growing political crisis also revealed deep divisions within New York's population that would persist throughout the Revolutionary period. While many merchants and artisans supported resistance to British taxation, others worried that rebellion would disrupt the profitable trade relationships that provided their livelihoods. Loyalist sentiment was particularly strong among Anglican clergymen, royal officials, and some of the wealthiest merchant families who had close ties to British commercial networks. These divisions became particularly apparent during the crisis over tea taxation that culminated in the Boston Tea Party of 1773. New York's merchants were deeply divided about how to respond when ships carrying East India Company tea arrived in the harbor. Some wanted to follow Boston's example and destroy the tea, while others preferred less dramatic forms of resistance that would not provoke British retaliation. The compromise that emerged, forcing the tea ships to leave without unloading their cargo, satisfied neither the most radical nor the most conservative elements of the resistance movement. The Intolerable Acts of 1774, passed by Parliament in response to the Boston Tea Party, created a new crisis that forced New York's residents to choose sides more clearly. These laws, which included the closing of Boston Harbor and the effective suspension of Massachusetts' colonial government, were widely seen as a threat to the rights of all Americans. The New York Assembly passed resolutions condemning the acts, while the city's merchants organized relief efforts for the people of Boston. Perhaps most importantly, New York played a crucial role in the development of intercolonial resistance through its participation in the Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia in September 1774, included prominent New York delegates like John Jay and Philip Livingston, who helped coordinate a unified colonial response to British policies. The Congress's decision to impose a comprehensive boycott of British goods gave New York's merchants a central role in what amounted to the first organized intercolonial political action in American history. The Second Continental Congress, which began meeting in May 1775 after fighting had broken out in Massachusetts, initially convened in New York City before moving to Philadelphia. During its brief time in New York, the Congress met in Fraunces Tavern and other locations that would later become iconic symbols of American independence. The decision to move the Congress to Philadelphia reflected both practical concerns about British naval power in New York, harbor, and political considerations about the city's divided loyalties. As 1775 progressed and the likelihood of armed conflict increased, New York became a center for military preparations that revealed both the strength and the weaknesses of the Patriot cause. Volunteer militia companies drilled in the city's parks and commons, while committees of safety attempted to coordinate defensive preparations. However, these efforts also revealed the deep divisions within the city's population, as many residents remained reluctant to support measures that seemed to point toward open rebellion. The political crisis reached its climax in early 1776, as news of Thomas Paine's Common Sense circulated through the city and influenced public opinion in favor of independence. The pamphlet's clear and powerful arguments against monarchy and hereditary privilege resonated with many New Yorkers who had grown frustrated with British policies. However, the city's strategic location and divided population would make it one of the most contested battlegrounds of the coming Revolutionary War. By the spring of 1776, New York had become the center of a political transformation that would reshape not only the city, but the entire Atlantic world. The merchant culture that had made the city prosperous had also created the intellectual and organizational resources necessary to challenge British authority effectively. However, the same factors that made New York central to the resistance movement, its strategic location, economic importance, and political sophistication, would also make it a prime target for British military action in the war that was about to begin. The summer of 1776 brought to New York Harbor the largest military expedition that had ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean, as Great Britain assembled an overwhelming force of ships and soldiers designed to crush the American rebellion at its most strategic point. The sight of more than 400 British vessels filling the waters around Staten Island created a spectacle that both awed and terrified the inhabitants of New York, marking the beginning of what would become the longest and most devastating military occupation in the city's history. General William Howe, commander of British forces in North America, had chosen New York as the focal point of his campaign for reasons that any military strategist could understand. Control of New York Harbor and the Hudson River would effectively cut the rebellious colonies in half, separating New England from the southern and middle colonies and making coordinated resistance virtually impossible. Moreover, New York's known loyalist sympathies and its economic dependence on British trade suggested that the city might welcome liberation from what many residents viewed as the tyranny of radical patriots. The American response to this British buildup revealed both the determination and the limitations of the revolutionary cause. General George Washington, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, had brought his forces south from their victory at Boston to defend New York, recognizing that the loss of the city would be a catastrophic blow to American hopes for independence. However, Washington's army of approximately 19,000 men was poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and facing an enemy force that outnumbered them by more than 2 to 1. The strategic challenges facing the Americans in defending New York were enormous. The city's location on islands and peninsulas connected by water made it extremely difficult to defend against an enemy with naval superiority. British ships could land troops at virtually any point along hundreds of miles of coastline, while the Americans were forced to guess where the next attack might come. Moreover, the city's large loyalist population meant that American commanders could never be certain that their plans would remain secret or that the civilian population would support their defensive efforts. The Battle of Long Island, fought on August 27, 1776, demonstrated the overwhelming advantages that professional military training and naval support could provide. British and Hessian forces, landing under cover of naval gunfire, outflanked and overwhelmed American defensive positions in what is now Brooklyn, inflicting heavy casualties while suffering minimal losses themselves. The American defeat was so complete that Washington's entire army might have been captured, if not for a brilliant nighttime evacuation across the East River, conducted under cover of fog and darkness. That seemed almost providential to the retreating soldiers. The successful evacuation of Washington's forces from Brooklyn Heights became one of the most celebrated episodes in American military history, demonstrating the resourcefulness and determination that would ultimately enable the Americans to outlast their more powerful enemy. Using every available boat, from naval vessels to fishing craft, Continental soldiers ferried their army across the East River in a single night, completing the operation just as British advance guards arrived at the abandoned fortifications. The evacuation saved the Continental Army from destruction, but it also marked the beginning of a series of retreats that would eventually carry American forces out of New York entirely. The British occupation that followed was both comprehensive and enduring, lasting from September 1776 until November 1783. General Howe established his headquarters in the city and began the complex process of administering what was simultaneously a military base, a refuge for loyalist civilians, and an occupied territory containing thousands of inhabitants of questionable loyalty. The British faced the challenging task of maintaining order and extracting resources from the city while simultaneously preparing for military operations that might extend across hundreds of miles of hostile territory for the civilian population of New York. The British occupation brought both relief and hardship in roughly equal measure. Loyalist families who had fled or gone into hiding during the period of Patriot control emerged to welcome their liberators and to reclaim property that had been confiscated by revolutionary committees. However, even Loyalist civilians soon discovered that military occupation imposed its own burdens. Soldiers needed to be housed and fed. Military operations took precedence over civilian needs, and the constant threat of American attack made normal economic life difficult to maintain. The transformation of New York into a British military base changed the character of the city in fundamental ways. Fortifications were constructed throughout Manhattan and the surrounding areas, while civilian buildings were converted to military use. Churches became barracks, warehouses became hospitals, and private homes were requisitioned to house officers and officials. The constant presence of soldiers, British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, and loyalist militia gave the city a martial atmosphere that contrasted sharply with its previous commercial character. The economic impact of the occupation was complex and contradictory. On one hand, the presence of thousands of soldiers and the constant need for military supplies created new opportunities for merchants and craftsmen who could provide goods and services to the occupying forces. The British military was generally well supplied with hard currency, providing a welcome change from the paper money and barter systems that had characterized much of the wartime economy. However, the war also disrupted many of the traditional trade relationships that had made New York prosperous, while British naval operations made normal maritime commerce dangerous and unpredictable. The social tensions created by the occupation were equally complex. The city became a refuge for loyalist families from throughout the colonies, swelling the population and creating housing shortages that often forced multiple families to share accommodations designed for single households. These refugees brought with them stories of persecution and property loss that reinforced loyalist determination to support the British cause, but they also created competition for resources, an employment that sometimes led to conflicts even among those who shared political sympathies. The presence of large numbers of British and Hessian soldiers created additional social complications. Cultural differences between the occupiers and the occupied led to frequent misunderstandings and conflicts, while the soldiers' need for entertainment and companionship created a thriving but often disreputable economy of taverns, gambling houses, and brothels. Military discipline was sometimes harsh and arbitrary, leading to resentment even among civilians who supported the British cause. Throughout the occupation, New York served as the headquarters for British intelligence operations throughout North America. The city became the center of a network of spies, informants, and messengers who provided military commanders with information about American troop movements, political developments, and economic conditions. This intelligence network was crucial to British military operations, but it also created an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance that affected every aspect of civilian life. The Great Fire of September 1776, which destroyed nearly a quarter of the city's buildings, illustrated the dangers and uncertainties that characterized life in occupied New York. While the cause of the fire was never definitively established, many British officials suspected arson by American agents, leading to increased security measures and heightened tensions between occupiers and occupied. The fire's destruction of hundreds of homes and businesses created additional hardships for civilians while demonstrating the vulnerability of even a heavily fortified city to certain types of attack. As the war progressed and it became clear that British hopes for a quick victory were unlikely to be realized, the character of the occupation began to change. What had initially been seen as a temporary military operation gradually became a more permanent arrangement, with British officials developing policies for long-term administration of occupied territory. This evolution created new opportunities for some civilians while imposing additional restrictions on others, as military authorities struggled to balance security concerns with the need to maintain economic productivity and civilian morale. The eventual British evacuation of New York on November 25, 1783, marked the end of one of the longest military occupations in American history. Evacuation Day, as it came to be known, was celebrated by returning patriots as a liberation, but it also marked the beginning of a difficult period of reconciliation and reconstruction. The city that emerged from 7 years of occupation was physically damaged, economically disrupted, and socially divided, but it retained the fundamental characteristics: strategic location, commercial orientation, and cultural diversity that would enable it to rebuild and eventually prosper once again. The transformation of New York from British-occupied stronghold to the first capital of the United States represented one of the most remarkable political and cultural reversals in American history. As British ships departed New York Harbor in late November 1783, carrying with them thousands of Loyalist refugees and 7 years of imperial administration, the city began the complex process of reinventing itself as the premier, urban center of a new and uncertain republic that had yet to prove its viability, either to its own citizens or to a skeptical world. The immediate aftermath of the British evacuation revealed both the damage that 7 years of military occupation had inflicted and the underlying strengths that would enable New York to recover more quickly than anyone might have expected. Many buildings had been damaged or destroyed during the occupation, while others had been modified for military use in ways that made them unsuitable for normal civilian purposes. The departure of Loyalist families and British military personnel had created a sudden vacuum in the city's economic life, as many of the merchants, craftsmen, and professionals who had sustained the wartime economy were no longer present. However, the return of patriot families who had fled during the British occupation brought new energy and resources to the city's reconstruction efforts. Many of these returning residents had maintained their business connections and accumulated capital during their years of exile, enabling them to resume commercial operations relatively quickly once normal conditions were restored. Moreover, the end of the war opened New York Harbor once again to unrestricted international trade, allowing the city's merchants to re-establish the commercial relationships that had made New York prosperous before the Revolution. The selection of New York as the temporary capital of the United States under the Articles of Confederation reflected both practical considerations and symbolic choices that would influence American political development for generations. The Confederation Congress needed a meeting place that was centrally located, easily accessible, and capable of providing the facilities necessary for national government operations. New York's harbor made it readily accessible to delegates from throughout the states, while the city's commercial infrastructure provided the financial and logistical support that government operations required. Perhaps more importantly, the choice of New York as the national capital represented a conscious decision to associate the new republic with the commercial prosperity and cultural sophistication that the city represented. Unlike Philadelphia, which was associated with radical politics and social experimentation, or Boston, which seemed too narrowly sectional, New York offered an image of cosmopolitan modernity that suggested America's potential for greatness. The city's tradition of religious tolerance and ethnic diversity also made it an appropriate symbol for a nation that hoped to unite peoples of different backgrounds under a common government. The arrival of the Confederation Congress in New York in 1785 marked the beginning of the city's brief but significant period as the center of American political life. Federal Hall, the renovated colonial city hall that served as the meeting place for Congress, became the focal point of national politics as delegates from throughout the states gathered to address the complex challenges facing the new republic. The presence of national political leaders brought prestige and economic benefits to the city, while also providing New Yorkers with unprecedented access to the debates and decisions that were shaping the country's future. The political discussions that took place in New York during these crucial years revealed the fundamental weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, while also demonstrating the need for more effective national government. The Confederation Congress struggled with basic questions of taxation, defense, and interstate commerce that the existing constitutional framework was unable to address effectively. New York's merchants and political leaders, observing these difficulties firsthand, became increasingly convinced that constitutional reform was necessary if the United States was to survive as an independent nation. The Constitutional Convention that met in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787 included several prominent New Yorkers, most notably Alexander Hamilton, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for strengthening the national government. Hamilton's experiences as a New York lawyer and his observations of the Confederation Congress's limitations had convinced him that only a dramatically stronger federal system could provide the stability and authority that commercial prosperity required. His contributions to the Constitutional Convention and his later work as a co-author of the Federalist Papers reflected both his personal convictions and the interests of the New York mercantile community that he represented. The ratification of the new Constitution created opportunities for New York to solidify its position as the nation's premier city, but it also generated intense political divisions that reflected broader disagreements about the proper role of federal government in American life. Hamilton led the Federalist forces that supported ratification, arguing that a stronger national government would promote economic development and protect property rights. However, many New Yorkers, led by Governor George Clinton, opposed the Constitution as a threat to democratic government and state sovereignty. The New York Ratifying Convention, which met in Poughkeepsie during June and July 1788, became one of the most important and dramatic political confrontations in early American history. Hamilton and his allies used every rhetorical and political weapon at their disposal to convince skeptical delegates that the Constitution would benefit rather than threaten New York's interests. The eventual ratification by the narrow margin of 3 votes demonstrated both the intensity of the political divisions and the effectiveness of Hamilton's political leadership. The inauguration of George Washington as the first President of the United States, which took place on the balcony of Federal Hall on April 30th, 1789, marked the climax of New York's role as the national capital and one of the most significant moments in American political history. The ceremony itself was carefully choreographed to project dignity and legitimacy, while avoiding the monarchical overtones that many Americans feared. Washington's choice to wear a simple brown suit, manufactured in Connecticut rather than elaborate European court dress, symbolized the Republic's commitment to democratic simplicity. The crowds that gathered to witness Washington's inauguration represented the full diversity of New York's population, from wealthy merchants in fine clothing to common laborers and craftsmen who had supported the revolutionary cause. The presence of foreign diplomats and dignitaries provided international recognition for the new republic, while the participation of ordinary citizens demonstrated the democratic character that Americans hoped would distinguish their government from the aristocratic regimes of Europe. The establishment of the federal government in New York brought immediate economic benefits to the city, as government officials, foreign diplomats, and political visitors required housing, food, entertainment, and other services that local businesses were eager to provide. The concentration of political power also attracted ambitious young men seeking careers in government service, adding to the city's population of educated and influential residents. Banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions found new opportunities to serve both government needs and the expanding private economy. However, New York's tenure as the national capital proved to be brief, as political considerations soon led to the decision to establish a new capital city on the Potomac River. The Compromise of 1790, negotiated between Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, provided for the assumption of state debts by the federal government in exchange for locating the permanent capital in the South. While this decision disappointed many New Yorkers who had hoped to retain the seat of government permanently, it also freed the city to focus on its commercial development without the distractions and limitations that political responsibilities sometimes imposed. The decade of the 1790s witnessed New York's emergence as the financial and commercial capital of the United States, a role that would prove more enduring and ultimately more important than its brief period as the political center. Hamilton's creation of the first Bank of the United States, with its main branch in Philadelphia, but important operations in New York, established the city as a center of national finance. The New York Stock Exchange, formally organized in 1792 with the signing of the Buttonwood Agreement, provided the institutional framework for the securities markets that would become central to American economic development. By the end of the 18th century, New York had successfully completed its transformation from colonial trading post to national metropolis. The city's merchants had re-established their international trade connections while developing new domestic markets that took advantage of the country's expanding territory and growing population. The combination of natural advantages, accumulated capital, political connections, and entrepreneurial skill had positioned New York to play a central role in the economic development of the young republic, setting the stage for the dramatic growth and expansion that would characterize the following century. The early decades of the 19th century brought to New York a transformation so dramatic and far-reaching that it would fundamentally alter not only the city's economic prospects, but the entire balance of power among American cities for generations to come. The construction of the Erie Canal, one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever undertaken in North America, would connect New York Harbor to the Great Lakes, and in doing so, establish the city's position as the undisputed commercial capital of the United States. The vision of connecting New York to the Western Territories through an artificial waterway had existed since the colonial period, when fur traders and military commanders recognized the strategic importance of creating a reliable transportation route between the Atlantic coast and the interior regions of the continent. However, the technical challenges involved in constructing a canal across 363 miles of varied terrain through forests, swamps, rocky ridges, and river valleys seemed almost insurmountable to most observers. Critics dismissed the project as Clinton's ditch, after DeWitt Clinton, the New York governor who became the canal's most passionate advocate. The political battle to authorize construction of the Erie Canal revealed the vision and determination that would characterize New York's approach to large-scale infrastructure development throughout the 19th century. Governor Clinton and his allies argued that the canal would not only benefit New York, but would strengthen the entire nation by binding the Western Territories more closely to the eastern states. They emphasized that the revenue generated by canal tolls would ultimately pay for the construction costs while providing the state with a permanent source of income. Opposition to the canal project came from several sources, each representing legitimate concerns about the enormous financial and technical risks involved. Conservative legislators worried about the unprecedented cost of the project, estimated at over $7 million at a time when the entire annual budget of New York State was less than $1 million. Skeptics questioned whether the engineering challenges could be overcome, pointing out that America lacked experienced canal engineers and would need to develop new techniques for construction in difficult terrain. Despite these concerns, the New York State Legislature authorized construction of the Erie Canal in 1817, launching what would prove to be one of the most successful public works projects in American history. The decision reflected both confidence in American engineering capabilities and recognition that the potential benefits justified the substantial risks involved. The project would employ thousands of workers, stimulate economic development throughout upstate New York, and demonstrate that democratic governments could undertake large-scale infrastructure projects successfully. The actual construction of the Erie Canal proved to be an extraordinary achievement that showcased American ingenuity, determination, and organizational capability. The project required the services of surveyors, engineers, contractors, and thousands of laborers who worked under difficult and often dangerous conditions to carve a waterway through wilderness areas that had never before seen large-scale development. Much of the labor was performed by Irish immigrants who had come to America seeking economic opportunity and found employment in the demanding work of canal construction. The engineering challenges encountered during construction forced American workers to develop innovative solutions that would influence infrastructure development throughout the country. The construction of locks to raise and lower canal boats over changes in elevation required precise stone cutting and hydraulic engineering that pushed the limits of available technology. The creation of aqueducts to carry the canal over rivers and valleys demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles. Perhaps most remarkably, the entire project was completed using only hand tools, horse-drawn equipment, and human labor. The western section of the canal, which connected Buffalo to Rochester, opened in 1823 and immediately demonstrated the project's enormous potential. Freight that had previously required weeks of difficult overland transportation could now be shipped efficiently and economically between the Great Lakes and the Hudson River. The cost of shipping a ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City dropped from approximately $100 to less than $10, making it profitable for Western farmers to sell their crops in Eastern markets for the first time. The completion of the entire Erie Canal in 1825 was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that captured the imagination of the entire nation. Governor Clinton participated in a symbolic Wedding of the Waters ceremony, pouring water from Lake Erie into New York Harbor to represent the union of the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. The celebrations included parades, speeches, and festivities that demonstrated New York's pride in its achievement, while showcasing the canal as a symbol of American progress and ingenuity. The economic impact of the Erie Canal exceeded even the most optimistic projections of its supporters, transforming New York from one important port among several into the undisputed gateway to the American interior. Within a decade of its completion, the canal was carrying more freight than all other American canals combined, while generating toll revenues that not only paid for its construction costs, but provided substantial profits for the state. The success of the Erie Canal inspired construction of numerous other canals throughout the country, though none would prove as successful or as strategically important. The canal's impact on New York City was immediate and transformative, as merchants and shippers recognized that the waterway had fundamentally altered the economics of American trade. Goods produced in the rapidly developing territories around the Great Lakes could now reach New York Harbor more cheaply and efficiently than they could reach any other Atlantic port. This transportation advantage enabled New York merchants to dominate trade with the Western territories, while also strengthening the city's position in international commerce. The demographic explosion that accompanied the canal's success reflected the enormous opportunities that improved transportation had created throughout the region. New York City's population nearly doubled between 1820 and 1840, growing from approximately 124,000 to over 312,000 residents as migrants from throughout the United States and Europe sought economic opportunities in the booming port city. This rapid growth created both unprecedented prosperity and serious challenges as the city struggled to provide housing, sanitation, and other services for its rapidly expanding population. The types of goods flowing through New York Harbor also changed dramatically, as the canal opened new markets and created new opportunities for trade. Western grain, particularly wheat from the fertile regions around the Great Lakes, became one of the most important commodities handled by New York merchants. Flour milling emerged as a major industry, as the city processed grain for both domestic consumption and export to European markets. At the same time, manufactured goods produced in New York and imported from Europe could be shipped economically to Western markets that had previously been too expensive to serve. The canal's success also stimulated the development of related industries and services throughout the New York region. Shipbuilding expanded rapidly as merchants demanded vessels designed specifically for canal and Great Lakes navigation. Banking and insurance services grew to meet the needs of the expanding trade networks, while warehousing and transportation services developed to handle the increasing volume of goods flowing through the port. The cultural impact of the Erie Canal was equally significant, as improved transportation and communication helped create stronger connections between New York and the developing Western territories. Ideas, information, and cultural influences could now flow more easily between the Atlantic coast and the interior regions, helping to create a more unified national culture while strengthening New York's position as a center of cultural as well as economic influence. The success of the Erie Canal also demonstrated the potential benefits of government investment in infrastructure development, providing a model that would influence American transportation policy for generations. The project showed that democratic governments could undertake large-scale infrastructure projects successfully when there was sufficient political will and public support. This lesson would prove particularly important as the country began developing railroad networks that would further enhance New York's transportation advantages. By the 1840s, the Erie Canal had established New York's position as the premier American metropolis, a status that would be reinforced and expanded by subsequent developments in transportation, finance, and industry. The canal had proven that strategic investments in infrastructure could create enormous economic benefits, while demonstrating American capabilities in engineering and construction. Most importantly, it had shown that New York's natural advantages could be enhanced and expanded through human ingenuity and determination, setting the stage for the city's emergence as one of the world's great urban centers. The middle decades of the 19th century witnessed one of the most dramatic demographic transformations in New York's history, as waves of immigrants from Europe and other parts of the world converged on the city, seeking economic opportunity, religious freedom, and escape from political persecution and economic hardship in their homelands. This massive influx of newcomers would fundamentally alter the character of New York, creating the cosmopolitan polyglot metropolis that would become synonymous with the American dream, while also generating social tensions and cultural conflicts that would influence the city's development for generations. The Irish immigration that began in earnest during the 1840s represented the largest single movement of people to New York during this period, driven by the catastrophic potato famine that devastated Ireland between 1845 and 1852. The failure of the potato crop, which had become the primary food source for much of Ireland's rural population, created conditions of starvation and desperation that forced millions of Irish men, women, and children to seek survival in other lands. For many, New York represented the closest and most accessible refuge from the horrors they were experiencing at home. The Irish immigrants who arrived in New York Harbor during these desperate years were often in terrible condition, having endured weeks or months aboard overcrowded ships, where disease, malnutrition, and death were constant companions. Many arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs, speaking only Gaelic, and possessing few skills that were immediately valuable in an urban, industrial economy. The scale of this immigration was unprecedented. In some years during the late 1840s, more Irish immigrants arrived in New York than the city's entire population had been just a few decades earlier. The concentration of Irish immigrants in particular neighborhoods created the city's first true ethnic enclaves, areas where newcomers could find familiar foods, hear their native language, practice their religion, and receive assistance from others who had made the difficult transition to American life. The most famous and notorious of these neighborhoods was 5 Points, located in Lower Manhattan near the present-day Civic Center, which became synonymous with poverty, crime, and social disorder in the minds of many middle-class New Yorkers. 5 Points derived its name from the intersection of 5 streets in an area that had originally been a respectable working-class neighborhood, but had deteriorated as the city's population growth outpaced its housing supply. The neighborhood's decline was accelerated by the construction of the Collect Pond, which had been filled in during the early 1800s, but had left the area with poor drainage and unstable foundations that made it unsuitable for quality housing. By the 1840s, 5 Points had become a maze of overcrowded tenements, basement apartments, and converted warehouses that housed thousands of immigrants in conditions that shocked even hardened observers. The living conditions in 5 Points and similar neighborhoods represented one of the darkest chapters in New York's urban development, as landlords packed as many families as possible into buildings that were never designed for residential use. Entire families often lived in single rooms without adequate ventilation, sanitation, or privacy, while basement apartments frequently flooded during heavy rains, creating breeding grounds for disease and despair. The lack of clean water, proper sewage disposal, and medical care made these neighborhoods extraordinarily dangerous places to live, with mortality rates that rivaled those of the worst slums in Europe. Despite these terrible conditions, 5 Points and similar neighborhoods also demonstrated the remarkable resilience and adaptability of immigrant communities. Irish immigrants created mutual aid societies, established Catholic churches and schools, and developed economic networks that helped newcomers find employment and housing. The neighborhood became famous for its music, dance, and cultural traditions that blended Irish heritage with American influences, creating new forms of entertainment that would eventually influence mainstream American culture. The German immigration that occurred simultaneously with the Irish influx brought a different set of challenges and opportunities to New York. German immigrants generally arrived in better economic circumstances than their Irish counterparts, often possessing skills in crafts and trades that were immediately valuable in the city's growing economy. Many German immigrants settled in areas that became known as Little Germany, particularly around the Lower East Side, where they established breweries, bakeries, music halls, and other businesses that served both immigrant and mainstream markets. The cultural contributions of German immigrants were particularly significant in areas such as music, education, and political activism. German immigrants brought traditions of classical music education and performance that enhanced New York's cultural life, while their commitment to public education and liberal political ideas influenced the city's intellectual development. Many German immigrants were also involved in labor organization and socialist political movements that would play important roles in the city's political development during the later 19th century. The arrival of immigrants from other parts of Europe added additional layers to New York's increasingly complex cultural landscape. Italian immigrants began arriving in significant numbers during the 1880s, establishing communities in areas such as Little Italy while contributing their skills in construction, food service, and small-scale manufacturing. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe brought traditions of scholarship, commerce, and craftsmanship that would profoundly influence the city's intellectual and economic development. The social tensions generated by this massive immigration were complex and often contradictory. On one hand, many established New Yorkers welcomed the cheap labor that immigrants provided, recognizing that their willingness to work for low wages helped keep costs down while contributing to the city's economic growth. Immigrant workers built the city's infrastructure, staffed its factories, and provided essential services that made urban life possible for all residents. However, this same immigration also generated fears and resentments among workers who worried that newcomers would depress wages and take jobs away from established residents. The cultural and religious differences between immigrants and established Americans created additional sources of tension, as Protestant New Yorkers worried about the growing influence of Catholic immigrants who seemed to maintain stronger loyalties to their churches than to American institutions. The political implications of mass immigration were equally complex, as immigrant communities became important constituencies for political parties and organizations seeking to build electoral coalitions. The Democratic Party, led by organizations such as Tammany Hall, proved particularly effective at organizing immigrant voters by providing them with jobs, services, and political representation in exchange for electoral support. This system of machine politics would dominate New York politics for generations, while also providing immigrants with pathways to political participation and influence. The economic impact of immigration was overwhelmingly positive for New York's development, as the availability of large numbers of workers enabled the city to undertake ambitious construction projects and industrial development that would not have been possible otherwise. Immigrant labor built the streets, sewers, and buildings that housed the city's growing population, while immigrant entrepreneurs established businesses that served both ethnic communities and mainstream markets. The cultural transformation brought about by mass immigration was perhaps even more significant than the economic changes, as New York became a laboratory for the development of new forms of American identity that incorporated influences from around the world. The city's restaurants, theaters, newspapers, and social organizations reflected this cultural mixing, creating new forms of entertainment, cuisine, and social organization that would eventually influence American culture far beyond New York's boundaries. By the 1860s, New York had been transformed from a predominantly English and Dutch city into a cosmopolitan metropolis where dozens of languages could be heard on the streets and where cultural traditions from around the world coexisted in close proximity. This transformation had created both unprecedented opportunities and serious challenges, as the city struggled to provide services and maintain order while accommodating the needs and aspirations of diverse communities with different languages, religions, and cultural traditions. The success of this great immigration experiment would depend largely on the city's ability to develop institutions and practices that could accommodate diversity while maintaining social cohesion and economic opportunity for all residents. The lessons learned during this period would influence American immigration policy and urban development for generations, establishing New York as both a symbol of American opportunity and a testing ground for the possibilities and challenges of creating a truly multicultural society. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 placed New York City at the center of a conflict that would test not only the unity of the nation, but also the complex social and economic relationships that had developed within the city during decades of rapid growth and immigration. As the war progressed, New York would experience both unprecedented economic prosperity and some of the most violent civil unrest in American history, revealing deep tensions within the city's diverse population, while also demonstrating the crucial role that the Metropolis played in sustaining the Union cause. The initial response to the war in New York reflected the city's complicated relationship with the slavery question and the preservation of the Union. While most New Yorkers supported the Union cause in principle, the city's extensive commercial relationships with the South created significant economic incentives for maintaining peaceful relations with the Confederate States. New York merchants had profited enormously from their role in financing and marketing Southern cotton, while the city's financial institutions held substantial investments in Southern plantations and enterprises that would be threatened by prolonged warfare. Despite these economic concerns, the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861 galvanized support for the Union cause throughout New York, as residents recognized that the survival of democratic government was at stake. Recruitment rallies in City Hall Park and other public spaces drew enormous crowds, while volunteer regiments formed rapidly, as young men sought to demonstrate their patriotism and participate in what many expected would be a brief and glorious conflict. The city's diverse immigrant communities were particularly eager to prove their loyalty to their adopted country, with Irish, German, and other ethnic regiments forming to represent their respective communities in the Union Army. The economic transformation that accompanied the Civil War was dramatic and far-reaching, as New York's merchants and manufacturers discovered that wartime demand for goods and services created unprecedented opportunities for profit. The federal government's need for uniforms, weapons, food, and other military supplies generated enormous contracts that enriched the city's businesses, while also stimulating the development of new industries and manufacturing techniques. Shipbuilding, metalworking, and textile production all expanded rapidly to meet wartime demands. The financial sector experienced perhaps the most dramatic growth, as the federal government's need to finance the war effort created new opportunities for banks, bond dealers, and other financial institutions. The establishment of a national banking system and the issuance of government bonds provided New York's financial community with new instruments and markets that would permanently enhance the city's position as the nation's financial capital. Jay Cooke and other prominent financiers used their New York connections to market government securities throughout the country and in European markets. However, this wartime prosperity was unevenly distributed and came at significant social cost, particularly for the city's working-class residents who bore the burden of military service while watching others profit from wartime contracts and speculation. The draft system established by the federal government in 1863 created particularly acute tensions, as it allowed wealthy men to avoid military service by paying a $300 commutation fee or hiring a substitute, effectively creating a system where the poor fought a war to benefit the rich. The draft riots that erupted in July 1863 represented one of the most violent episodes of civil unrest in American history, revealing the depth of social tensions that had been building within New York's diverse population throughout the war years. The immediate trigger for the riots was the implementation of the federal draft, But the violence that followed reflected much deeper grievances about economic inequality, racial competition, and political representation that had been festering for years. The riots began on July 13, 1863, when crowds of predominantly Irish working-class men attacked the draft office on 3rd Avenue, setting fire to the building and destroying draft records. However, the violence quickly spread beyond opposition to the draft itself, as rioters began attacking symbols of wealth and privilege throughout the city. Elegant homes on Lexington Avenue were burned, while Republican newspaper offices and other political targets were destroyed by mobs that included thousands of participants. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the draft riots was the racial violence that accompanied the anti-draft protests, as white rioters targeted African American residents who were blamed for causing the war and threatening white job security. The Colored Orphan Asylum on 5th Avenue was burned to the ground, while individual African Americans were attacked and sometimes murdered by mobs that seemed determined to drive the entire black population from the city. The violence was so intense that many African American families fled to New Jersey or other areas where they hoped to find safety. The suppression of the draft riots required the intervention of federal troops, including regiments that were withdrawn from the Gettysburg battlefield and rushed to New York to restore order. The use of military force against civilian rioters demonstrated the federal government's determination to maintain control over its most important city, but it also revealed the fragility of social order in a diverse urban environment where different groups competed for economic opportunity and political influence. The aftermath of the riots led to significant changes in both city governance and federal policy, as officials recognized the need to address some of the underlying grievances that had contributed to the violence. The draft system was modified to reduce some of its most obvious inequities, while city officials began developing new approaches to managing the diverse communities that made up New York's population. The riots also demonstrated the need for better police organization and more effective emergency response systems. Despite the trauma of the draft riots, the Civil War period also witnessed significant positive developments in New York's urban infrastructure and cultural life. The construction of Central Park, which had begun in the 1850s under the direction of Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, continued throughout the war years and provided the city with one of the world's most innovative examples of urban park design. The park's creation reflected both the city's growing wealth and sophistication and its recognition of the need for public spaces that could serve all residents regardless of their economic circumstances. The design of Central Park represented a revolutionary approach to urban planning that sought to create a naturalistic landscape within the heart of a densely populated city. Olmsted and Vaux's plan called for the creation of meadows, lakes, and forests that would provide city residents with access to natural beauty and recreational opportunities that had previously been available only to those wealthy enough to escape to the countryside. The park's design also included separate circulation systems for pedestrians, carriages, and commercial traffic, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of urban transportation needs. The construction of Central Park required the displacement of several established communities, including Seneca Village, a predominantly African-American settlement that had existed in the area since the 1820s. This displacement reflected the complex dynamics of urban development in 19th century New York, as public improvements often came at the cost of less powerful communities that lacked the political influence to protect their interests. The destruction of Seneca Village was particularly significant because it eliminated one of the few areas where African Americans had been able to establish property ownership and community institutions. The industrial development that accelerated during the Civil War laid the foundation for New York's emergence as a major manufacturing center that would compete with established industrial cities like Philadelphia and Boston. The concentration of capital, labor, and transportation facilities in New York created ideal conditions for the development of diverse manufacturing industries that could serve both local and national markets. Clothing manufacturing became particularly important, as the city's immigrant communities provided both skilled workers and entrepreneurial Leadership that would make New York the center of the American fashion industry, the cultural developments that accompanied this economic growth were equally significant. As New York's growing wealth and sophistication attracted artists, writers, and performers who helped establish the city as a major cultural center. The establishment of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other cultural institutions reflected both civic pride and recognition that a great city required great cultural amenities. The development of a vibrant newspaper and publishing industry made New York a center of American intellectual life, while also providing forums for political debate and social commentary. By the end of the Civil War, New York had been transformed from a commercial port into a complex industrial and financial metropolis that played a central role in the American economy. The war had accelerated trends that had been developing for decades, while also revealing social tensions that would continue to influence the city's development throughout the 19th century. The decades following the Civil War ushered in an era of unprecedented wealth accumulation and conspicuous consumption in New York that would become known as the Gilded Age, a period when the city served as both the symbol and the center of American capitalism's most extravagant excesses. This was an era when individual fortunes reached astronomical proportions, when magnificent mansions lined Fifth Avenue like palaces, and when the gap between rich and poor became a chasm that threatened the very foundations of democratic society. The transformation of New York into America's capital of wealth began with the emergence of a new class of industrialists and financiers who had accumulated unprecedented fortunes through their involvement in railroads, steel production, oil refining, and financial speculation. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had built a transportation empire that controlled much of the railroad traffic between New York and the Midwest, possessed wealth that exceeded the budgets of most European nations. William Backhouse Astor Jr., heir to a real estate fortune that had been accumulating since the early 19th century, owned much of Manhattan's most valuable property. Andrew Carnegie, though based in Pittsburgh, maintained lavish residences in New York while building his steel empire into one of the world's largest industrial enterprises. These titans of industry and finance competed not only in business, but also in displays of wealth that reached levels of ostentation that seemed almost incomprehensible to ordinary Americans. The construction of palatial mansions along Fifth Avenue became a symbol of this competitive extravagance, as wealthy families sought to outdo each other in architectural grandeur and luxurious amenities. The Vanderbilt family alone built several massive residences, including William Henry Vanderbilt's triple mansion that occupied an entire block between 51st and 52nd Streets and was decorated with art treasures imported from European palaces. The architectural style of these Gilded Age mansions reflected their owners' desire to associate themselves with European aristocracy and classical civilization. Many were designed in elaborate neo-Gothic, Renaissance revival, or Beaux-Arts styles that incorporated elements from French chateaux, Italian palazzos, and English country houses. The interiors were furnished with authentic antiques, rare tapestries, and art collections that had been assembled by purchasing entire rooms from European castles and monasteries. The Astor's mansion featured a ballroom that could accommodate hundreds of guests, while the Whitney's residence included a private art gallery that rivaled many public museums. The social rituals that accompanied this display of wealth became legendary for their extravagance and exclusivity. Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Jr., known simply as the Mrs. Astor, established herself as the arbiter of New York society, determining through her famous 400 list who would be accepted into the city's social elite. Her annual balls were events of international significance, requiring months of preparation and featuring entertainment, decorations, and cuisine that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. The competition among wealthy families to host the most elaborate parties led to ever more spectacular displays of luxury and waste. However, this concentration of wealth also generated enormous social tensions and political controversies that would shape New York's development throughout the Gilded Age. The contrast between the palatial mansions of Fifth Avenue and the overcrowded tenements of the Lower East Side became a powerful symbol of American inequality. While the political influence wielded by wealthy, individuals raised serious questions about the compatibility of extreme wealth concentration with democratic government. The most notorious example of this political corruption was the Tweed Ring, led by William M. "Ian Boss" Tweed, who controlled New York's Democratic Party machine and used his political power to steal millions of dollars from the city treasury through inflated contracts, fake invoices, and other fraudulent schemes. Tweed and his associates demonstrated that political corruption could operate on an industrial scale when government officials and business leaders collaborated to exploit public resources for private gain. The construction of the New York County Courthouse, which became known as the Tweed Courthouse, illustrated the brazen nature of this corruption. The building, which should have cost approximately $250,000, ultimately cost over $13 million as Tweed and his associates inflated every aspect of the construction process. Carpets that cost $7 per yard were billed at $170 per yard, while furniture purchases included $179,000 for chairs and tables that never existed. The courthouse became a symbol of political corruption that outraged honest citizens and reformers throughout the country. Tweed's political machine maintained power through a combination of vote buying, patronage distribution, and service provision that created networks of dependency among New York's immigrant communities. The machine provided jobs for unemployed workers, assistance for struggling families, and political representation for groups that might otherwise have been excluded from the political process. However, these services came at enormous cost to taxpayers and created a system of corruption that undermined public confidence in democratic institutions. The exposure and eventual prosecution of the Tweed Ring represented a significant victory for reform, movements that sought to clean up New York politics and reduce the influence of corrupt political machines. The investigation was led by reformers like Samuel J. Tilden and supported by newspapers such as the New York Times, which published detailed evidence of the ring's fraudulent activities. The political cartoons of Thomas Nast, published in Harper's Weekly, played a particularly important role in arousing public opinion against Tweed and his associates. The economic development that occurred during the Gilded Age was not limited to the accumulation of individual fortunes, but also included significant improvements in urban infrastructure and industrial capacity. The construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, demonstrated both the engineering capabilities and the aesthetic ambitions that characterized the era. The bridge, designed by John Augustus Roebling and completed by his son Washington Roebling after the elder Roebling's death, was the longest suspension bridge in the world and became an immediate symbol of American technological achievement. The development of the elevated railway system during this period provided New York with its first rapid transit network, enabling workers to live farther from their jobs while still maintaining reasonable commuting times. The elevated lines, though noisy and unsightly, dramatically improved transportation within Manhattan, while also stimulating real estate development in areas that had previously been too remote to attract residential construction. The success of the elevated railways demonstrated the potential for public transportation to shape urban development patterns. The industrial growth that accompanied these transportation improvements transformed New York into one of the world's major manufacturing centers. The garment industry became particularly important as the city's immigrant communities provided both skilled workers and entrepreneurial leadership that made New York the center of American clothing production. The concentration of related industries, textile importing, pattern making, cutting, sewing, and finishing, created economies of scale that allowed New York manufacturers to compete successfully with producers in other cities. The cultural development that occurred during the Gilded Age reflected both the growing wealth of the city's elite and their desire to establish New York as a rival to European cultural centers. The establishment of the Metropolitan Opera in 1883 provided the city with a world-class venue for operatic performance, while the expansion of the Metropolitan Museum of Art created one of the world's great art collections. These cultural institutions served not only as centers of artistic activity, but also as symbols of the city's cultural sophistication and social prestige. The philanthropy that accompanied the accumulation of great fortunes represented one of the more positive aspects of Gilded Age wealth concentration, as millionaires like Andrew Carnegie articulated a gospel of wealth that called upon the rich to use their fortunes for public benefit. Carnegie's funding of libraries throughout the United States, including several in New York, provided communities with educational resources that might not otherwise have been available. Similarly, wealthy New Yorkers funded hospitals, schools, and cultural institutions that served the broader public, while also enhancing the city's reputation and amenities. However, critics of Gilded Age inequality argued that private philanthropy could never compensate for the social problems created by extreme wealth concentration and the political corruption that often accompanied it. Reformers like Henry George, whose book Progress and Poverty became one of the most widely read economic treatises of the era, argued that the concentration of land ownership and natural resource control was creating permanent class divisions that threatened democratic institutions and social stability. By the 1890s, the contradictions of Gilded Age society had become increasingly apparent to observers, both within and outside New York. The city had achieved unprecedented prosperity and cultural sophistication, but it had also developed levels of inequality and social tension that raised serious questions about the sustainability of existing economic and political arrangements. The challenge facing New York as it entered the 20th century would be to maintain its economic dynamism while addressing the social problems that rapid growth and wealth concentration had created. The closing years of the 19th century brought to New York a series of transformative developments that would establish the city's position as America's undisputed metropolis and one of the world's great urban centers. The dawn of the 20th century marked not only a new era in human history, but also the beginning of New York's emergence as the economic, cultural, and symbolic capital of the American century that was about to unfold. The most significant political development of this period was the consolidation of the 5 boroughs in 1898, which created Greater New York and instantly made it the second largest city in the world after London. This unprecedented municipal merger brought together Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island under a single government, creating a metropolis of over 3 million inhabitants that dwarfed every other American city. The consolidation was the result of years of political maneuvering and economic calculation, as leaders recognized that the region's continued growth and competitiveness required coordinated administration and unified infrastructure development. The political battle over consolidation revealed deep divisions within the region about the benefits and costs of metropolitan government. Brooklyn, which had been the 4th largest city in the United States before the merger, maintained a distinct identity and proud municipal tradition that many residents were reluctant to surrender. However, the economic advantages of consolidation, shared infrastructure costs, coordinated transportation development, and unified administration ultimately convinced a narrow majority of voters to support the merger. The creation of Greater New York immediately transformed the city's fiscal capacity and administrative capabilities, enabling projects and services that would have been impossible for the separate municipalities to undertake individually. The unified government could now coordinate the development of bridges, tunnels, and transit systems that connected the different boroughs while also providing standardized municipal services throughout the metropolitan area. This administrative integration laid the foundation for the massive infrastructure projects that would reshape the city during the early 20th century. Ellis Island emerged during this period as one of the most powerful symbols of American opportunity and New York's role as the gateway to the Promised Land. The Federal Immigration Station, which opened in 1892, processed over 12 million immigrants between 1898 and 1920, making it the busiest port of entry in American history. The experience of passing through Ellis Island became a rite of passage for millions of families whose descendants would populate not only New York, but communities throughout the United States. The immigrant processing system at Ellis Island represented both American efficiency and the complex bureaucratic machinery that modern nations use to regulate population movement. New arrivals underwent medical examinations, legal inspections, and administrative procedures that determined whether they would be admitted to the United States or sent back to their countries of origin. The vast majority, approximately 98%, were admitted after processing that typically took only a few hours, though for some the experience was traumatic and life-changing. The new wave of immigration that flowed through Ellis Island during this period was notably different from earlier immigrant populations, both in its countries of origin and in its social and economic characteristics. While Irish and German immigrants had dominated 19th century immigration, the new arrivals came primarily from southern and eastern Europe: Italy, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. These immigrants brought different languages, religions, and cultural traditions that added new layers to New York's already complex ethnic landscape. Italian immigration became particularly significant during this period, as economic hardship and political instability in southern Italy drove hundreds of thousands of families to seek opportunities in America. Italian immigrants established vibrant communities in areas like Little Italy and East Harlem, bringing traditions of food, music, and family organization that would profoundly influence American culture. The concentration of Italian immigrants in construction and food service industries made them essential contributors to New York's continued growth and development. Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe represented another crucial component of this new wave, as political persecution and economic restrictions in Russia and Poland drove millions of Jewish families to seek refuge in America. These immigrants brought traditions of education, commerce, and intellectual achievement that would significantly influence New York's cultural and economic development. The Lower East Side became the center of Jewish immigrant life, with synagogues, schools, theaters, and newspapers that maintained connections to Old World traditions while adapting to American circumstances. The architectural revolution that transformed New York's skyline during this period represented one of the most dramatic changes in urban form in human history. The development of steel frame construction techniques and the invention of reliable passenger elevators made it possible to construct buildings of unprecedented height, leading to the emergence of the skyscraper as a distinctly American contribution to world architecture. New York's dense population and expensive real estate created ideal conditions for vertical development that maximized the use of valuable urban land. The first generation of skyscrapers, including the Flatiron Building completed in 1902, demonstrated both the possibilities and the challenges of high-rise construction. These buildings required new approaches to structural engineering, fire safety, and mechanical systems that pushed the boundaries of available technology. The distinctive triangular shape of the Flatiron Building, designed to fit an irregularly shaped lot at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue, became an immediate symbol of New York's architectural innovation and urban sophistication. The development of skyscraper architecture also reflected changing concepts of urban beauty and civic pride, as architects and city planners debated whether tall buildings enhanced or degraded the urban environment. Critics worried that skyscrapers would create dark, congested streets while destroying the human scale that made cities livable and beautiful. Supporters argued that vertical development was essential for accommodating urban growth, while creating dramatic skylines that symbolized American progress and achievement. The transportation innovations that accompanied this urban transformation were equally revolutionary, as New York developed some of the world's most sophisticated mass transit systems to move its growing population efficiently throughout the expanded metropolis. The construction of the first subway line, which opened in 1904, represented a triumph of engineering and urban planning that enabled millions of people to live and work in different parts of the city while maintaining reasonable commuting times. The subway system's impact on urban development patterns was immediate and profound, as neighborhoods that had previously been considered too remote for dense development suddenly became accessible to workers employed in Manhattan's business districts. The extension of subway lines into Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx stimulated massive residential construction that provided housing for the city's growing population while also creating new commercial districts that served local communities. The electrification of transportation systems during this period reflected broader technological changes that were reshaping urban life throughout the developed world. Electric streetcars replaced horse-drawn vehicles, while electric lighting began to illuminate streets and buildings throughout the city. These technological innovations made urban life safer, more convenient, and more comfortable, while also creating new industries and employment opportunities that contributed to the city's economic growth. The cultural developments that accompanied these physical and demographic changes established New York as America's center of artistic and intellectual activity. The concentration of wealth, education, and cultural institutions created an environment that attracted artists, writers, and performers from throughout the United States and Europe. The city's theaters, museums, and concert halls offered opportunities for cultural expression and consumption that were unmatched anywhere else in America. The newspaper and publishing industries that flourished during this period made New York the center of American intellectual life, as the city's publishers and editors shaped public opinion throughout the country. The competition among major newspapers like The World, The Herald, and The Times drove innovations in journalism and printing technology, while also providing forums for political debate and cultural commentary that influenced national discussions on important issues. The labor movement that emerged during this period reflected both the opportunities and the challenges that industrial development had created for working-class New Yorkers. The concentration of manufacturing industries and the presence of large numbers of immigrant workers created conditions that were conducive to labor organization, while also generating conflicts between workers and employers over wages, working conditions, and political representation. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, which killed 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, became a powerful symbol of the need for workplace safety regulations and labor protection laws. The tragedy, which resulted from inadequate safety measures and locked emergency exits, galvanized support for progressive reforms that would improve working conditions while also demonstrating the human costs of unregulated industrial development. By 1910, New York had established itself as the unquestioned center of American urban civilization, a metropolis that combined unprecedented scale with remarkable diversity and innovation. The city's population had grown to over 4 million inhabitants, while its economic output exceeded that of many entire countries. The foundation had been laid for New York's emergence as a global city that would play a central role in shaping the 20th century's political, economic, and cultural developments. The early decades of the 20th century witnessed New York's transformation into not merely an American metropolis, but a world city whose influence extended across continents and whose innovations in architecture, culture, and urban living would inspire imitators and admirers throughout the globe. This was the era when New York truly became the city that never sleeps, a place where human ambition and creativity seemed to know no bounds, where the very skyline became a symbol of modernity and progress that captured the imagination of people everywhere. The architectural achievements of this period represented perhaps the most visible manifestation of New York's growing confidence and ambition, as the city reached ever higher into the sky with buildings that seemed to defy both gravity and conventional notions of what was possible in urban construction. The Chrysler Building, completed in 1930, embodied the artistic and technological aspirations of the era, with its distinctive Art Deco design and gleaming metallic crown that caught and reflected the changing light throughout the day. The building's innovative use of metalwork, geometric patterns, and vertical emphasis created a new aesthetic vocabulary that would influence architectural design throughout the world. The Empire State Building, completed in 1931 in the remarkably short time of just 410 days, represented the culmination of New York's skyscraper age and became perhaps the most famous building in the world. Rising 1,454 feet above street level, it was the tallest structure on Earth for over 4 decades and served as a powerful symbol of American technical achievement and economic might. The building's construction employed over 3,400 workers, mostly European immigrants, and Mohawk ironworkers whose fearless work high above the city streets became legendary in American folklore. The Art Deco movement that flourished during this period reflected New York's position at the forefront of international cultural trends, while also expressing distinctly American themes of optimism, progress, and technological achievement. This design aesthetic, characterized by bold geometric patterns, stylized natural forms, and luxurious materials, appeared not only in major buildings, but also in everyday objects from radio cabinets to subway mosaics. The movement represented a uniquely American approach to modernism that celebrated machine-age technology while maintaining humanistic values and decorative beauty. The Harlem Renaissance emerged during the 1920s as one of the most significant cultural movements in American history, establishing New York's Harlem neighborhood as the center of African-American intellectual and artistic achievement. This flowering of creativity brought together writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, and visual artists like Aaron Douglas and Augusta Savage, who created works that celebrated African-American heritage while contributing to mainstream American culture. The Cotton Club, the Apollo Theater, and other Harlem venues became internationally famous centers of entertainment that attracted audiences from throughout the world while providing platforms for African-American performers to develop their artistry and reach broader audiences. The music that emerged from Harlem during this period, jazz, blues, and swing, represented genuinely new forms of artistic expression that would influence popular culture throughout the world, while also providing African Americans with unprecedented opportunities for economic success and cultural recognition. The intellectual achievements of the Harlem Renaissance extended far beyond entertainment, as African American scholars, writers, and activists used their cultural prominence to address issues of civil rights, social justice, and racial equality that would remain central to American political discourse throughout the 20th century. The movement demonstrated that artistic excellence could serve as a powerful tool for social change, while also establishing New York as a center of progressive political thought and cultural innovation. The Great Depression that began with the stock market crash of 1929 tested New York's resilience and adaptability in ways that few could have imagined during the prosperous 1920s. The economic collapse that followed Black Tuesday devastated the city's financial sector, while creating unemployment and hardship that affected every neighborhood and every social class. The breadlines and Hoovervilles that appeared in Central Park became powerful symbols of the Depression's impact on even the wealthiest and most successful American city. However, the New Deal programs implemented by the Roosevelt administration provided New York with unprecedented opportunities for public works projects and social programs that would reshape the city's infrastructure while providing employment for thousands of unemployed workers. The Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and other federal agencies funded the construction of bridges, highways, parks, and public buildings that enhanced the city's amenities while demonstrating the potential for government intervention to address economic and social problems. The leadership of Fiorello LaGuardia, who served as mayor from 1934 to 1945, exemplified the reform spirit that characterized New York's response to the Depression. LaGuardia, a progressive Republican who worked closely with the Roosevelt administration, implemented comprehensive reforms in city government, while also securing federal funding for major infrastructure projects. His administration cleaned up municipal corruption, improved city services, and launched ambitious construction projects that included new airports, highways, and housing developments. The construction of LaGuardia Airport and the expansion of municipal services during this period reflected New York's determination to maintain its position as America's premier city despite the economic challenges of the Depression. The city's leaders recognized that continued investment in infrastructure and services was essential for attracting businesses and residents, while also providing employment opportunities that could help the city recover from the economic downturn. World War II brought another dramatic transformation to New York, as the city became the center of America's mobilization for global conflict, while also serving as the headquarters for international organizations working to defeat fascism and build a more peaceful post-war world. The Brooklyn Navy Yard and other military installations employed hundreds of thousands of workers producing ships, aircraft, and other military equipment essential to the Allied war effort. The war also brought new waves of migration to New York, as African Americans from the South, women entering the workforce, and immigrants from war-torn Europe sought opportunities in the city's booming defense industries. This demographic change accelerated social transformations that had been developing for decades, while also creating new challenges for city administrators trying to provide housing, transportation, and services for a rapidly changing population. The establishment of the United Nations headquarters in New York in 1946 symbolized the city's emergence as a center of international diplomacy and global governance. The decision to locate the UN in New York reflected both American political influence and recognition that the city possessed the infrastructure, cultural amenities, and international connections necessary to serve as a meeting place for representatives from around the world. The cultural developments that accompanied these political and economic changes established New York as the undisputed center of American artistic and intellectual life. The concentration of publishers, theaters, museums, and educational institutions created an environment that attracted creative talent from throughout the United States and the world, while also providing audiences sophisticated enough to support experimental and challenging artistic work. The abstract expressionist movement that emerged in New York during the 1940s represented a particularly significant cultural achievement, as American artists like Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko created works that established New York as a rival to Paris as the center of contemporary art. This artistic movement reflected both American confidence and the influence of European refugees who had brought new ideas and techniques to the American art world. The development of television broadcasting during this period added another dimension to New York's cultural influence, as the major networks established their headquarters in the city and began producing programs that reached audiences throughout the country. The concentration of advertising agencies, production companies, and broadcast facilities made New York the center of the emerging television industry, while also enhancing the city's role in shaping American popular culture. The urban planning innovations that characterized this period, particularly the work of Robert Moses as Parks Commissioner and later as head of various construction authorities, reshaped New York's physical landscape in ways that would influence urban development. Throughout the United States, Moses's projects included highways, bridges, beaches, parks, and housing developments that improved transportation and recreation facilities, while also demonstrating the potential for comprehensive regional planning. However, Moses's approach to urban development also reflected the limitations and contradictions of mid-20th century planning philosophy, as his emphasis on automobile transportation and suburban development patterns sometimes conflicted with the pedestrian-oriented, neighborhood-based character that had made New York unique among American cities. The tension between modernist planning principles and traditional urban forms would become an important theme in debates over New York's future development. By 1950, New York had established itself as one of the world's great cities, a metropolis that combined unprecedented scale with remarkable diversity and innovation. The city's population had reached nearly 8 million inhabitants, while its cultural and economic influence extended throughout the world. The foundation had been laid for New York's continued growth and development during the latter half of the 20th century, though new challenges and opportunities would test the city's adaptability and resilience in ways that few could have anticipated. The latter half of the 20th century brought to New York a series of dramatic transformations that would test the city's resilience and adaptability in ways that few could have imagined during the confident decades following World War II. This period witnessed both the near collapse of America's greatest metropolis and its remarkable recovery and reinvention, creating the foundation for New York's emergence as a truly global city in the 21st century. The urban crisis that engulfed New York during the 1960s and 1970s reflected broader social and economic changes that were reshaping American society throughout the post-war period. The suburbanization that had begun during the 1920s accelerated dramatically after World War II, as federal highway construction and mortgage programs enabled middle-class families to abandon city neighborhoods for new suburban communities that promised safety, space, and modern amenities. This middle-class exodus drained the city of tax revenue while concentrating poverty and social problems in neighborhoods that lacked the resources to address them effectively. The deindustrialization that accompanied suburbanization proved equally devastating to New York's economic foundation, as manufacturing companies relocated their operations to suburban and southern locations where land was cheaper, labor costs were lower, and regulations were less restrictive. The garment industry, which had employed hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers since the late 19th century, virtually disappeared as manufacturers moved production to overseas locations where wages were a fraction of American levels. The racial tensions that had been building throughout the post-war period erupted in violence during the 1960s as African American and Latino communities protested against discrimination, police brutality, and economic exclusion that had persisted despite civil rights legislation. The Harlem riots of 1964 and subsequent disturbances in other neighborhoods reflected deep frustrations with persistent inequality and lack of economic opportunity that affected minority communities throughout the city. The fiscal crisis that reached its climax in 1975 brought New York to the brink of bankruptcy and forced city officials to confront the reality that decades of generous spending on social programs and municipal services had created financial obligations that the city could no longer afford. The dramatic reduction in federal aid that occurred during the Nixon administration, combined with the loss of middle-class taxpayers and the decline of the city's industrial base, created a fiscal emergency that threatened the city's ability to provide basic services. The federal government's initial refusal to provide financial assistance to New York was captured in the famous Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead," which reflected widespread sentiment throughout the country that New York's fiscal problems were the result of municipal irresponsibility rather than broader economic forces beyond the city's control. This federal indifference forced city officials to implement severe austerity measures that included massive layoffs of municipal workers, reductions in city services, and increases in taxes and fees that further discouraged business, investment, and middle-class residents. The physical deterioration that accompanied the fiscal crisis created images of urban decay that shocked observers throughout the world and seemed to symbolize the failure of American urban civilization. Abandoned buildings covered with graffiti, vacant lots filled with rubble, and streets littered with trash created an atmosphere of disorder and danger that drove away visitors and investors while reinforcing negative stereotypes about urban life. The South Bronx became the most powerful symbol of this urban collapse, as vast areas of the borough were abandoned by landlords who found it more profitable to burn their buildings for insurance money than to maintain them for low-income tenants. The landscape of destruction that resulted, block after block of burned-out buildings and empty lots, was so shocking that it was compared to war zones in Europe and Asia. However, even during the darkest years of the urban crisis, community organizations, religious institutions, and grassroots activists were working to address the problems that government agencies seemed unable or unwilling to confront. Neighborhood groups organized to clean up parks and streets, provide services for children and elderly residents, and advocate for better police protection and municipal services. These community-based efforts, though often small in scale, demonstrated the resilience and determination that would eventually contribute to the city's recovery. The recovery that began during the 1980s was driven by a combination of factors that included changes in global economic patterns, federal policy reforms, and local initiatives that addressed some of the underlying causes of urban decline. The emergence of New York as a center of international finance during the 1980s created new sources of employment and tax revenue that helped stabilize the city's fiscal situation, while also attracting educated professionals whose presence began to reverse the middle-class exodus of previous decades. The Wall Street boom of the 1980s, driven by financial deregulation and the growth of international capital markets, created unprecedented opportunities for wealth accumulation that attracted ambitious young professionals from throughout the world. The expansion of investment banking, securities trading, and corporate law created high-paying jobs that enabled their holders to afford expensive Manhattan apartments while also generating tax revenues that helped fund improved municipal services. The cultural renaissance that accompanied this economic recovery reflected New York's continued ability to attract creative talent and innovative enterprises that enhanced the city's reputation as a center of artistic and intellectual achievement. The art market boom of the 1980s made New York the center of the international contemporary art world, while the emergence of new music genres like hip-hop demonstrated the city's continued capacity for cultural innovation. The crime reduction that began during the 1990s under Mayor Rudy Giuliani represented one of the most dramatic urban transformations in American history. As New York evolved from one of the most dangerous cities in the United States to one of the safest, the implementation of community policing strategies, the targeting of quality-of-life offenses, and the use of statistical analysis to identify crime patterns contributed to a reduction in violent crime that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The attacks of September 11, 2001, tested New York's resilience in ways that few could have imagined, as the destruction of the World Trade Center killed nearly 3,000 people, while also devastating the city's financial district and threatening its economic foundation. The heroic response of firefighters, police officers, and ordinary citizens during the attack and its aftermath demonstrated the strength and unity that could emerge from tragedy, while also highlighting the city's importance as a symbol of American values and aspirations. The recovery from September 11th required not only the physical reconstruction of damaged areas, but also the restoration of confidence among residents, workers, and visitors who had to overcome fears about the safety and security of urban life. The gradual rebuilding of Lower Manhattan, including the construction of One World Trade Center and the September 11th Memorial and Museum, reflected both determination to honor those who had been lost and commitment to maintaining New York's role as a center of international commerce and culture. The gentrification that accelerated during the early 21st century brought both benefits and challenges to neighborhoods throughout the city, as rising property values and improved amenities attracted new residents, while also displacing long-term residents who could no longer afford increased rents and property taxes. The transformation of previously affordable neighborhoods like Williamsburg in Brooklyn and the Lower East Side in Manhattan reflected broader economic forces that were reshaping cities throughout the developed world. The demographic changes that accompanied gentrification created new forms of diversity and cultural mixing that enhanced New York's reputation as a cosmopolitan metropolis, while also generating tensions between newcomers and established residents. The arrival of young professionals, artists, and entrepreneurs in previously working-class neighborhoods created new businesses, restaurants, and cultural institutions, while also changing the character of communities that had maintained stable identities for generations. The immigration patterns that continued throughout this period brought new waves of newcomers from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, who added additional layers to New York's already complex ethnic landscape. These new immigrants often settled in outer borough neighborhoods where they established businesses, schools, and cultural institutions that served their communities while also contributing to the city's economic vitality and cultural richness. The environmental challenges that became increasingly apparent during this period included air and water pollution, inadequate waste management, and the urban heat island effect that made summer temperatures significantly higher in the city than in surrounding areas. These challenges required new approaches to urban planning and environmental management that could balance economic development with ecological sustainability. By 2010, New York had completed one of the most remarkable urban transformations in modern history, evolving from a city in crisis to a global metropolis that attracted millions of visitors, thousands of new businesses, and hundreds of thousands of new residents each year. However, this recovery had also created new challenges related to housing affordability, income inequality, and environmental sustainability that would require innovative solutions and continued adaptation to address effectively. As New York enters the third decade of the 21st century, the city stands as perhaps the most powerful symbol of human achievement in urban civilization. A metropolis that has successfully navigated centuries of transformation to emerge as the undisputed capital of global finance, culture, and innovation. With over 8 million residents representing virtually every nation and culture on Earth, New York has become the closest approximation to a truly cosmopolitan world city that humanity has yet created, a place where the future of urban life is being written in real time. The financial sector that has long been central to New York's economy has evolved far beyond its traditional role as a center of American banking and securities trading to become the nerve center of global capitalism. Wall Street and the broader financial district now serve as the primary hub for international currency trading, commodity markets, and the complex financial instruments that connect economies across continents. The major investment banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms, headquartered in New York, manage trillions of dollars in assets while making decisions that affect economic conditions throughout the world. The emergence of financial technology companies has added a new dimension to New York's role in global finance, as entrepreneurs and engineers develop digital platforms that are revolutionizing how money moves and how financial services are delivered. These fintech innovations, ranging from mobile payment systems to cryptocurrency exchanges, reflect New York's ability to maintain its competitive advantages by embracing new technologies and business models that enhance rather than replace traditional financial services. The cultural influence that emanates from New York continues to shape global trends in art, fashion, entertainment, and lifestyle choices that affect billions of people worldwide. The city's museums, theaters, and cultural institutions set standards for artistic excellence, while also serving as incubators for experimental work that pushes the boundaries of creative expression. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, and dozens of other cultural institutions house collections that represent the finest achievements of human creativity, while also supporting contemporary artists who are creating the masterpieces of tomorrow. The fashion industry, centered in New York's Garment District and extending throughout Manhattan, continues to influence global style trends, while also supporting thousands of designers, manufacturers, and retailers who create everything from haute couture to mass-market clothing. New York Fashion Week has become one of the most important events in the global fashion calendar, attracting buyers, journalists, and celebrities from throughout the world while generating billions of dollars in economic activity. The media and communications industries that have long been centered in New York have adapted to digital technologies and global markets in ways that have enhanced, rather than diminished, the city's influence over public opinion and cultural trends. The major television networks, newspaper publishers, and digital media companies headquartered in New York reach audiences throughout the world while also serving as training grounds for journalists, entertainers, and content creators who shape public discourse on issues ranging from politics to popular culture. However, New York's continued success as a global metropolis faces significant challenges that will require innovative solutions and sustained commitment to address effectively. The housing affordability crisis has reached levels that threaten the city's ability to maintain the economic and cultural diversity that has long been its greatest strength. The median rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan now exceeds $3,000 per month, making it impossible for teachers, firefighters, nurses, and other essential workers to live in the communities they serve without significant subsidies or extremely long commutes. The gentrification pressures that have transformed neighborhood after neighborhood have created a pattern of displacement that threatens to eliminate the middle class and working class communities that have historically provided the city with much of its character and vitality. Long-established ethnic neighborhoods in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx are experiencing rapid change as rising property values force out families and businesses that have served their communities for generations. The environmental challenges facing New York reflect both the city's enormous scale and its position on the front lines of climate change. Rising sea levels threaten to flood significant portions of the city during major storms, as demonstrated by Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which caused over $60 billion in damage, while highlighting the vulnerability of critical infrastructure built at or near sea level. The city's aging subway system, sewage treatment plants, and electrical grid all require massive investments to adapt to changing environmental conditions. The carbon emissions generated by 8 million residents and millions of daily visitors contribute significantly to global warming, while also creating local air quality problems that affect public health. The city's ambitious plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 will require fundamental changes in how buildings are heated and cooled, how people travel within the city, and how waste is managed and disposed of. The transportation infrastructure that enables New York to function as a unified metropolis requires continuous investment and innovation to maintain service levels while accommodating growing ridership and changing travel patterns. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority operates one of the world's largest public transit systems, carrying over 5 million passengers daily on a network of subways, buses, and commuter rail lines that connect the 5 boroughs and surrounding suburbs. However, decades of deferred maintenance and insufficient investment have created reliability problems that affect millions of commuters while also threatening the city's economic competitiveness. The inequality that has grown significantly during recent decades threatens to undermine the social cohesion and economic mobility that have long made New York an attractive destination for ambitious individuals from around the world. The gap between the highest and lowest paid workers has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, creating social tensions and political pressures that could affect the city's ability to maintain the policies and institutions that support its continued growth and development. Despite these challenges, New York's fundamental strengths position it well for continued success in an increasingly connected and competitive global economy. The city's concentration of human capital, highly educated, creative, and ambitious individuals from throughout the world, creates an environment for innovation and entrepreneurship that cannot be easily replicated. The density that makes New York expensive and sometimes difficult to navigate also creates efficiencies and opportunities for collaboration that are impossible in more dispersed metropolitan areas. The diversity that has always been New York's defining characteristic has become an even greater asset in a global economy where success often depends on understanding different cultures, languages, and market conditions. The city's immigrant communities maintain connections to their countries of origin that facilitate international trade and investment, while also creating cultural resources that attract visitors and enhance the city's appeal as a place to live and work. The technological innovations that are reshaping urban life throughout the world are finding some of their most interesting applications in New York, as entrepreneurs and engineers develop solutions to the unique challenges of high-density living. Smart city technologies that optimize traffic flow, reduce energy consumption, and improve public safety are being tested and refined in New York before being adopted in other metropolitan areas. The commitment to sustainability and environmental responsibility that has emerged as a central theme in New York's planning and development reflects recognition that long-term prosperity depends on creating urban systems that can function effectively within planetary boundaries. The city's initiatives in renewable energy, waste reduction, and green building design are creating models that other cities can adapt, while also generating new industries and employment opportunities. As New York looks toward the future, its success will depend on maintaining the delicate balance between growth and livability, between economic dynamism and social equity, between global engagement and local community that has characterized the city's development throughout its long history. The challenges are significant, but so are the resources, human, financial, and institutional, that New York can mobilize to address them. The story of New York is ultimately the story of human ambition and creativity unleashed in one of the world's most favorable environments for urban development. From its origins as a Native American homeland, through its emergence as a global metropolis, the city has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation and renewal that suggests it will continue to play a central role in shaping the urban future of our increasingly connected world. The next chapters of this ongoing story will be written by the millions of individuals who choose to make New York their home, their workplace, and their contribution to the continuing evolution of humanity's greatest urban achievement.